Murder at the Midsummer Ball at Thornton Park, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Lanterns of Thornton Park. The road to Thornton Park in the latter part of June 1936 was a winding thread of pale gravel cutting through the dark green of the Hertfordshire woods, and Captain Arthur Hastings, sitting beside Hercule Poirot in the back of the hired Daimler, found himself in that pleasant, drowsy state which a long drive on a warm afternoon will produce in any reasonable man. The hedges, heavy with the bloom of dog-rose, slipped past the windows, rooks circled lazily above the elms, and somewhere beyond the trees the bell of a country church marked the hour with 3 slow, careful strokes. "You are not, mon ami, in your usual state of energetic conversation," observed Poirot, who had been watching me for some moments with that small, amused smile of his. "You sleep, almost. Is the prospect of the country so very fatiguing?" "Not at all," I said, sitting up rather guiltily. "I was thinking how peculiar it is that of all places in England, we should be invited to Thornton Park for the Midsummer Ball. I had not seen Lady Margaret Thornton Vyse for, 6 or 7 years, and now suddenly a letter arrives in your name and mine, both of us. What did you make of it, Poirot?" "I made it," said Poirot, with a slight inclination of his egg-shaped head, "exactly what was written. That Lady Margaret has been pleased to remember our small acquaintance from the affair of the Pembroke necklace, and that she invites us to her summer ball, nothing more, but—" and here a curious expression crossed his face. "The postscript, you observed it?" "Of course." "The bit about wanting your professional advice on a private matter?" "Yes, I noticed." "Précisément. A small matter, a trifle. Probably it is nothing. Lady Margaret is an intelligent woman. She would not summon Hercule Poirot for a trifle, and so we go, you and I, to dance the foxtrot among the roses, and to listen, perhaps, to what truly disturbs her." The Daimler rounded a final bend, and there, lying in a shallow valley of cropped pasture and ornamental water, stood the house itself. Thornton Park was not the largest of the Hertfordshire estates, but it was, to my eye, among the loveliest. A long, low house of warm Tudor brick with later Jacobean wings, its mullioned windows catching the late afternoon sun like rows of small, cheerful eyes. Tall yews stood sentinel along a terrace, a stone fountain played in the forecourt, and beyond the house the ground fell away to a lake, beyond which rose the dark mass of the homewood. "Voilà," murmured Poirot, sitting forward. "Now this is what the English do supremely well. The garden, the proportion, the small dignity of stone. One does not find such things in Brussels." The car drew up at the steps, and Lady Margaret herself came out to meet us, accompanied by her butler, a thin, stately person of perhaps 60, whom I afterwards learned was named Felling. Lady Margaret was a tall, fine-featured woman of about 45, with iron-grey hair severely arranged, and a pair of blue eyes that, even in the act of greeting, seemed to take a careful, measured account of one. She wore a gown of dove-grey silk with a single string of pearls. Her hands, I noticed, were unusually slender and very pale. "Monsieur Poirot." "Captain Hastings. How very good of you both to come." She offered her hand to each of us in turn. "I had begun to wonder whether you would arrive before tea. The road from Hatfield can be cruel in the heat. Felling will see to your luggage. I've put you in the U-room and the garden-room respectively. They connect, which I thought might suit you." "Madame, you are most thoughtful. Come through to the long gallery. Most of the house party have already arrived. They are taking tea on the terrace. But before you meet them," and her voice dropped a little, "I should like 5 minutes alone with you, Monsieur Poirot, in the library. Captain Hastings, would you forgive us? My niece Daphne is on the terrace. She will provide you with tea and chatter." I bowed, and was duly delivered by the silent Felling to the south terrace, where a small company sat among lavender and old roses. There was, I observed, a young woman in white at the tea-table, who must be Daphne, an elderly clergyman with a remarkably pink face, a tall, sallow gentleman of perhaps 50 in tweeds, a stout, smiling lady in mauve, a pale, fair-haired young man with a slightly petulant mouth, and a dark, handsome woman of perhaps 30, smoking with a graceful insolence. "Captain Hastings!" cried the young woman in white, springing up. "Aunt Margaret said you were coming. I am Daphne Vyse, and I am extremely glad to see somebody under 60. Do come and have a sandwich. Allow me to present everybody, only you must not expect me to remember half their names. I've only known most of them since yesterday." So began my acquaintance with the house party at Thornton Park, a circle of perhaps a dozen people gathered for the Midsummer Ball, of whom several were to play a most disagreeable part in the events that followed. Of the conversation that took place, in those quiet, sun-warmed minutes upon the terrace, I shall write more particularly in due course. But of one thing I became certain almost at once, that beneath the easy laughter of that summer afternoon, beneath the clink of china and the murmur of bees in the lavender, there ran a current of something not at all easy, a tension, a watchfulness, an unspoken thing, which I, who had been a soldier and was not insensitive to atmosphere, could feel as plainly as I could feel the warm flagstones beneath my chair. Lady Margaret rejoined us perhaps 20 minutes later with Poirot beside her, and I observed that my friend's small dark eyes, though he smiled and bowed and complimented the roses, were already moving from face to face with that particular quiet intensity which I had learned, in the course of our long association, to recognise and to fear a little, on behalf of whichever of these pleasant people had cause to be afraid. The introductions were repeated for Poirot's benefit. There was the Reverend Stephen Crail, the local vicar, whose pinkness was, I gathered, the result of equal parts sun and port. There was Sir Julian Mortlake, the tall sallow man, who proved to be a barrister of some distinction, and a cousin of Lady Margaret's late husband. There was Mrs. Pelham, the stout lady, a widow with a great fortune and a great love of music. There was the petulant young man, Mr. Roderick Vyse, Lady Margaret's nephew and the heir presumptive of Thornton Park. There was the dark, handsome smoker, Mrs. Iris Lamond, recently divorced, who had been at school with Daphne's mother. And there was Daphne herself, 22, fair, charming, and engaged, as I learned almost at once, to Mr. Geoffrey Standish, a young man not yet arrived from town. "And Geoffrey will come on the 6:20, said Daphne, glancing rather frequently at the long shadow of the cedar upon the lawn, "and Mr. Penrose will not arrive at all until tomorrow morning, and Cousin Beatrice," she sighed. "Cousin Beatrice is already here, of course, but she does not, as a rule, take tea." "Cousin Beatrice?" inquired Poirot. "Miss Beatrice Thornton Vyse," said Lady Margaret in a level voice. "My late husband's elder sister. She lives with us. She is, I am afraid, an invalid. She keeps to her own rooms in the east wing. You will meet her at dinner, which she always insists on attending in spite of everything." "In spite of?" "In spite of pain, Monsieur Poirot. She has a most distressing affliction of the nerves and lives in great discomfort. She is also, I should warn you, exceedingly outspoken." "Ah," said Poirot with the faintest of smiles. "I like very much an outspoken woman. They are the great enemies of falsehood." There was a small silence at this, and I noticed, or thought I noticed, the quick exchange of a glance between Sir Julian and Mrs. Lamond. Then Daphne laughed and offered me another cucumber sandwich, and the moment passed, and the talk turned to the ball, and the orchestra coming up from London, and the Chinese lanterns that were even now being strung among the limes for the great evening on the morrow. But the impression remained with me, and remained, I think, with Poirot also. As we rose to go in and dress for dinner, he said to me very quietly in French that there was much under the surface here, and that he should be obliged to me if I would be observant, for once, in my entirety. And I, who had so often borne the gentle barbs of his criticism, promised that I would try. The sun was sinking now behind the home wood, and the long shadows of the cedars lay black and exact upon the grass, and from somewhere beyond the lake came the slow, contented call of a wood pigeon. The lanterns of Thornton Park for the great Midsummer Ball were at that very moment being hung, and not one of us, walking in to dress for dinner upon that pleasant evening, knew that within 24 hours one of those lanterns would shine down upon a man who would be alive no longer. Chapter 2. A disagreeable dinner and Miss Beatrice's fork. Dinner at Thornton Park was served at 8:30, in a long panelled dining room hung with darkened portraits of Thornton Vyses going back to the reign of Elizabeth, the whole illuminated by a vast Venetian chandelier whose candles that night had been freshly lit out of deference to the Reverend Crail's known dislike of electric light. Felling and a single footman moved noiselessly behind us. The silver was old and very heavy. The soup was a clear consommé in which a single sliver of truffle floated like a small dark island. I had been placed between Mrs. Pelham, the stout musical widow, and Daphne, who looked very pretty in pale blue and whose fiancé Mr. Geoffrey Standish had at last arrived upon the 6:20 and was now seated opposite, addressing himself to Mrs. Lamond with what I considered an excessive attention. He was a slim, dark, well-dressed young man with a quick, mobile face and an air of slight, perpetual amusement. I formed of him at once the impression of one of those men whom women find captivating, and other men do not. Daphne's eyes strayed more than once across the table, but it was upon Miss Beatrice Thornton Vyse that I confess my chief interest centred. She had been wheeled in by her companion, a quiet, sandy-haired young woman of perhaps 28 named Miss Ellen Brand, and placed at the foot of the table opposite Lady Margaret. Miss Beatrice was perhaps 65, with a face that must once have been handsome and was now a fine-drawn map of suffering, the cheekbones sharp, the dark eyes glittering, the mouth set in a permanent thin line of pain controlled. She wore black silk, an old-fashioned cameo at her throat and a great quantity of rings upon her wasted fingers. She ate almost nothing, but spoke, when she spoke, with a clear, carrying, rather ironic voice. "Margaret," she said, before the fish had been quite removed, "I have decided that I do not after all approve of this ball." Lady Margaret's face did not alter. "Indeed, Beatrice? You disapproved of last summer's ball also, as I recall." "Last summer's ball was vulgar. This summer's ball will be a vulgarity and a folly. There is too much money being spent and too little reason for spending it. Roderick, do not pretend to drink that wine. It is far too good for you, and you do not appreciate it." Roderick Vyse, the petulant young heir, flushed an unpleasant colour. "I beg your pardon, Aunt Beatrice." "You may beg, but you will not receive. Mr. Poirot." Her dark eye fixed upon my friend, who sat upon her right. "I have read of you in the newspapers. You are the little Belgian who solves murders. Have you come to solve one here?" "I have come, mademoiselle," said Poirot, with a small courtly bow over his soup-spoon, "as a guest of your sister-in-law, to attend a ball, and to admire, if I may, the beauty of the English summer." "That is a very pretty answer. It is also a complete lie. My sister-in-law does not invite professional detectives to country balls without a reason. She does not invite anyone without a reason. Margaret, why have you invited him?" "Because, Beatrice—" "I wish to," said Lady Margaret in a voice of such quiet finality that even Miss Beatrice was silent for a moment. "Humph," she said at last. "Well, you will all do as you please. You always do. Miss Brand, my fork, please. I have dropped my fork." I looked, and indeed her silver fork was lying upon the parquet beside her chair. Miss Brand, with the silent quickness of long practice, retrieved it and replaced it. A clean fork was brought. The meal proceeded. But I observed that Poirot, while he continued to eat his fish with the most perfect composure, had not missed the small incident, and that his eyes had rested for a fraction of a second upon Miss Beatrice's hand, the right hand which lay now upon the cloth, and which, I now perceived for the first time, trembled a very little, with the smallest, most controlled of tremors. The conversation, after Miss Beatrice's outburst, was for some time confined to the safe subjects of the weather, the prospects for the harvest, and the unfortunate health of the king. Sir Julian Mortlake, sitting upon Lady Margaret's left, addressed his remarks principally to her and to Mrs. Pelham. He had, I observed, a curiously soft voice for so tall a man, and a habit of pausing very slightly before pronouncing certain words, as though he weighed each one in advance for its possible effect. The Reverend Crail told 2 anecdotes about his curate. Mrs. Pelham spoke of a recent concert at the Wigmore Hall. Mrs. Lamond and Mr. Standish laughed quietly together over some private observation which I did not catch, but which caused Daphne at my side to set down her glass with a small, hard click. It was at the entrance of the second course that Miss Beatrice spoke again, and with even greater effect than before. "Margaret," she said, "I have changed my mind. I shall, after all, alter the will." A silence fell at the table, such as I have rarely heard. Even Felling, in the act of pouring claret for Mr. Standish, paused in the very motion of his hand. Lady Margaret laid down her knife. "Beatrice, I think we will not discuss such matters at table. I think we will. Mr. Hodge is coming on Saturday after the ball, and I shall sign the new instrument in his presence. I've given it a great deal of thought, and I have concluded that the present arrangement is unjust. There, I have said it. Pass the salt, Roderick. Do not sit gaping at me like a carp." Roderick Vyse, I noticed, was indeed somewhat carp-like in expression at that moment. He passed the salt with a hand that shook quite visibly. Sir Julian opposite him remained perfectly still. Only his sallow face had gone a shade paler. Miss Brand, the companion, had lowered her eyes to her plate and seemed to be eating with great determination. Daphne was looking at her aunt with something between surprise and a kind of secret, breathless interest. Geoffrey Standish, alone of the company, appeared faintly amused and shot a quick look across the table at Mrs. Lamond, who returned it with the lift of one fine dark eyebrow. "As you please, Beatrice," said Lady Margaret after a pause, "but you will forgive me if I refuse to discuss your private affairs in the presence of guests." "Oh, the guests," said Miss Beatrice, with an extraordinary harsh little laugh. "The guests are part of it. The guests are very much part of it. Are they not, Mr. Poirot?" "Mademoiselle," said Poirot very gently, "I do not understand you." "No, perhaps you do not. Yet. Miss Brand, I am tired. Wheel me out." "Margaret, good night. Good night to all of you." And without another word she was wheeled from the room, leaving behind her a silence which lasted, I should say, almost a full minute, before Lady Margaret, with the most admirable self-command, turned to Mrs. Pelham and inquired whether she had heard the new Heifetz recording of the Mendelssohn. The rest of the meal passed without further incident, though the talk was forced, and the laughter, when it came, had an artificial brightness that deceived nobody. The ladies withdrew. The men sat for some 20 minutes over the port, during which time Sir Julian, with great composure, expounded a theory upon the recent crisis in Spain, and at length we joined the ladies in the drawing-room, where bridge was set up at one table, and Mrs. Pelham played a little Schumann at the piano upon the other. Poirot did not play bridge. He drew me away, by the smallest of gestures, into the long gallery, which lay open to the drawing-room through a wide arch, but was, at that hour, empty. He took my arm and walked me up and down the polished floor beneath the eyes of the painted Thornton vases in silence for some moments. "Well, Hastings?" he said at last. "Well," I said, "it is a most disagreeable family." "Ah, you think so? And what of the old lady, the formidable Miss Beatrice? Did she, in your view, mean what she said about the will?" "Yes, I'm sure of it." "Did you notice the look on Roderick's face?" "I noticed many things." "I noticed the look upon Roderick's face, yes. I noticed also the look upon Sir Julian Mortlake's face, which was rather more controlled, but not less interesting. I noticed Miss Brand. I noticed Mrs. Lamond, who was not afraid, and Mr. Standish, who was amused. I noticed Daphne, who was watching Mr. Standish, who was watching Mrs. Lamond. And I noticed, mon ami, a thing of which I am not yet entirely sure of the meaning." "What was that?" "The fork," said Poirot. "The fork that fell and the right hand that trembled. Miss Beatrice has a great pride. She does not ordinarily drop her fork, yet at the very moment, the precise moment, when she had finished a small private conversation with me, she did so. A small, untidy thing, in a woman who is the soul of order. It interests me, Hastings. It interests me considerably. Poirot, what did Lady Margaret want to see you about this afternoon in the library?" He stopped his walking and looked at me for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "She wanted to tell me, my friend, that someone in this house has, during the last fortnight, been writing letters, anonymous letters, to Miss Beatrice, and that Miss Beatrice has been, as a consequence, very much disturbed, and has begun to speak, as you heard tonight, of altering her will." I stared at him. "Anonymous letters? About what?" "That, mon ami, Lady Margaret does not know. Miss Beatrice will not show them to her. But Miss Beatrice, who has been tonight so very rude, so very theatrical, Miss Beatrice has, in fact, been extremely frightened, and it is for that reason that we are here." He took out his great old-fashioned watch, looked at it with care, and put it away again. "Tomorrow," he said, "is the Midsummer Ball. There will be 300 lanterns and an orchestra from London and champagne, and dancing in the open air until 2 in the morning. It will be very beautiful, Hastings. I hope very much that nothing will happen to spoil it, but," and his small dark eyes were grave, "I do not, in my heart, expect to be spared." Chapter 3. The Garden Before the Ball. I slept that night, the broken, fitful sleep of a man whose mind has been disturbed at the hour of going to bed. The moon, very nearly full, fell in a long silver bar across the polished floor of the garden-room, and twice I rose and went to the open window and stood looking out across the parterre, where the lanterns had been hung that afternoon, hundreds of them, in long swaying lines from the trees, dark and unlit now and waiting for the evening. I rose early. The morning of the 24th of June, Midsummer Day itself, dawned still and almost cloudless, with that particular blue clarity which the English sky achieves perhaps half a dozen times in a season. I dressed and went down to the breakfast room and found Poirot already there, sipping a cup of his abominable tisane and reading, with an air of grave concentration, the inside page of the Times. "Bonjour, mon ami. You sleep badly?" "Tolerably." "You have the air of one who has held conferences with himself in the small hours. Take some coffee. The coffee at Thornton Park is, I'm happy to say, excellent." I helped myself to coffee and a kidney from the sideboard, and we sat for some minutes in companionable silence. The room was empty, save for ourselves. The long French windows stood open upon the south terrace. Somewhere outside a thrush was singing with a great clear repetitive joy. "Poirot," I said at length, "I have been thinking, the anonymous letters. Could it not simply be that Miss Beatrice imagines them?" He looked at me over the top of his newspaper. "It is possible. It is even, perhaps, plausible. An invalid, alone in a great house, brooding upon old grievances, comes in time to construct enemies where none exist. Yes, it is a hypothesis, but it does not, I confess, satisfy me." Miss Beatrice's fear last night was real, Hastings. The theatre of her behaviour was real also, but underneath the theatre was the fear, and one does not, as a rule, fear one's own imagination with such precision. What did Lady Margaret tell you exactly? That perhaps a fortnight ago, Miss Beatrice received the first letter. It was unsigned, typewritten, and was placed not in the post but under her bedroom door in the night. She showed it briefly to Miss Brand, who tells Lady Margaret it was a single line to the effect that "you will not live to alter what you have planned." Miss Beatrice afterwards refused to discuss the matter and locked the letter away. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, by the same means. Miss Brand did not see it. 3 days ago, a third. Last night, while we dined, a fourth was found upon her dressing table by Miss Brand, when she went up to prepare her for bed. Good God! Yes, it is at this last that Miss Beatrice has become, you might say, defiant. Hence her announcement at dinner, hence the speech of the will. She intends, I think, to provoke whoever is doing this into showing his hand. His? You think it is a man? Poirot smiled faintly. I use the indefinite. It may be a woman. It may be more than one person. We shall see. What does Lady Margaret want you to do? She wants me to discover the writer of the letters before the writer does anything more serious. She's also, I suspect, afraid for her own person, though she has not said so. And Miss Beatrice? Have you spoken to her? I am to be granted an audience this morning at 11 o'clock in her own sitting room. Until then, mon ami, we shall walk in the garden. It is a fine morning, and one may learn much in a great house by the simple act of walking in the garden before breakfast is over. He rose, neat as ever in his pale grey suit, and we went out together upon the terrace. I shall not weary the reader with a full description of Thornton Park's gardens. They have been more than once in country life, and may be referred to there. Let me say only that we passed first along the south parterre, where the roses bloomed in their hundreds upon the warm brick walls, thence by the long yew walk between dark green hedges 12 feet high, thence to the lake, upon whose surface a pair of swans moved in slow, indifferent grace. Thence by way of the rose garden proper, a circular enclosure with a sundial at its centre, to the lime avenue, which ran, lanterns and all, from the south door of the house down to the small classical pavilion called the Temple of Diana at the eastern edge of the park. It was a walk of perhaps 3/4 of a mile, and as we went Poirot observed everything with that small, contained attention which others might have mistaken for the casual pleasure of a Sunday tourist. In the yew walk we encountered Sir Julian Mortlake, who was strolling with a Sunday paper folded under one arm and a pipe in his mouth. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, a glorious morning. Most glorious, monsieur. You'll find, said Sir Julian, falling into step beside us, that this place has its way of working upon one. Margaret has done wonders since poor Henry's death. Henry had, between us, no eye for a garden. He paused and added, I trust you were not too much disturbed by my cousin's conduct at dinner. Not at all, monsieur. Miss Beatrice possesses a remarkable spirit. Spirit, yes, she has spirit. She has also, as you may have gathered, a most unfortunate gift for theatre. She has been threatening to alter her will for 30 years, Mr. Poirot. It is a kind of family ritual. None of us takes it very seriously. None of you? None of us who have known her long enough." He smiled with the slow, sallow smile of an experienced advocate. "Roderick, of course, is young and takes it more to heart. So, I dare say, does my own modest expectation. But between gentlemen, one would not advise placing money upon any particular outcome. You are yourself a beneficiary, Sir Julian? A small legacy, I believe, a token of family loyalty, nothing on the scale of the principal disposition." He puffed his pipe. "The principal disposition, as the family has long understood, is to come almost entirely to Roderick, with a substantial sum to Daphne and a number of charitable bequests. Beatrice is, you see, exceptionally rich in her own right. Her father left her all the Thornton money, which was a good deal more than the Vyse money. It was a settlement Margaret's husband always regarded as deeply unjust, but there it is." "And the alteration of which Miss Beatrice spoke last night?" Sir Julian looked at him with a curious level attentiveness. "Yes, that is perhaps the small puzzle of the moment. I confess I do not know what she intends. If you discover Mr. Poirot, you will be cleverer than the rest of us." We parted from him at the end of the yew walk, and Poirot, as we descended towards the lake, said softly, "An interesting man, our Sir Julian. Observe, mon ami, that in 3 minutes he has informed us that the alteration of the will is unimportant, that it is impossible to predict, and that he himself stands to gain only a small legacy. 3 statements, of which I think 2 at least are intended for our consumption, rather than for the truth." At the lake we encountered Mrs. Lamond, smoking again, this time in a long ivory holder, and feeding the swans with rolls. She was wearing slacks of a man's cut and a striped jumper, and looked, in the morning light, rather harder than she had looked the night before. "Mr. Poirot, I had hoped to catch you alone." She tossed a fragment of bread to the larger swan with an air of careless practice. "I do not, as a rule, trouble myself in other people's affairs, but I think you should know that the old woman is half mad, and that you should believe perhaps a quarter of what she says. Madame, you are very direct. I am usually direct. I have nothing in this house to gain or to lose, you see. I am merely here because Daphne's mother, who was my dearest friend, made me promise that I should look in upon Daphne occasionally, so I look in. And what I see, Mr. Poirot, is a young woman about to make a most unsuitable marriage, an old woman who enjoys the suffering she inflicts, and a household perfectly capable of any folly you can imagine. I tell you this so that you do not, when something dramatic occurs, attribute to it more weight than it deserves. You expect, then, that something dramatic will occur? In this house?" She laughed shortly. "My dear Mr. Poirot, something dramatic occurs at Thornton Park before breakfast every morning, and twice on Sundays. Take no notice of it. Forgive me, I must dress for the day. Iris Lamond, by the way, is my name. You may use it." She left us. Poirot, watching her go, murmured, "Another candidate for our affections. Mon ami, I begin to think that we shall have no shortage of opinions in this house, and a very great shortage of facts." The clock on the stable tower struck 11:15. Poirot pulled out his watch, compared it gravely, and said, "I have my appointment with the formidable Miss Beatrice. Hastings, I am going to ask of you a service. Please, in my absence, go to the Temple of Diana at the end of the Lime Avenue. Sit there, observe who comes and who goes, and note, particularly, anything which seems to you out of the ordinary, however small. You are at liberty also to admire the architecture. I am told it is a charming pavilion. I was, I confess, a little wounded." "Poirot, am I to play sentry, then?" "You are to play observer, mon ami. There is a difference. The garden is being prepared all day for the ball. Persons will pass through it upon all manner of pretexts. I wish to know who passes, and at what hour, and with whom. It is a trifle, perhaps, but trifles, Hastings, are sometimes the whole of the matter." I went then to the Temple of Diana as bidden, and from a stone bench within its small white colonnade I watched the comings and goings of that warm summer morning with a notebook upon my knee. I shall here set down briefly what I observed, for some of it was afterwards of great importance. At 11 o'clock 2 gardeners and a boy passed me, carrying further bunches of lanterns. They were employed all morning at the Lime Avenue and in the parterre. At 12 minutes past 11 Mr. Roderick Vyse came down the avenue, walking quickly. His head bent. He passed the temple without seeing me, struck off into the homewood by a side path, and did not return that way. At 11:25 Miss Brand passed, walking the small terrier which Miss Beatrice was said to dote upon. She nodded to me in passing and went on towards the lake. At 11:40, Mr. Geoffrey Standish came down from the house alone, smoking a cigarette. He hesitated at the temple, looked in, saw me, raised his hat with an easy smile, and continued on towards the home wood. At 10 minutes past 12, Mrs. Lamond came down by the same way, saw me, and turned aside without entering, taking the path that ran along the haha. At 28 minutes past 12, the Reverend Crail, looking very pink, came down with a butterfly net, an enthusiasm of his I afterwards learned, and went off towards the meadow. At 12:35, Daphne and Sir Julian came down together in conversation. They did not see me, being absorbed in their talk. They passed within 20 feet of the temple, and I caught one phrase in Sir Julian's soft voice, which I noted carefully. "Then I suggest, my dear, that you say nothing whatever to your aunt until after the ball." They turned at the temple steps and went back together towards the house. At 10 minutes to 1, Poirot himself came down the avenue and joined me upon the bench. "Eh bien, Hastings, you have observed?" I gave him my list. He took it, read it twice with the greatest attention, and then folded it small and put it in his waistcoat pocket. "Mon ami," he said, "you have done very well indeed. Now, luncheon, and after luncheon, the great preparation for the ball. Tonight, Hastings, the lanterns will be lit, and tonight, unless I am very much mistaken, certain other matters will be lit also. Did you see her, Miss Beatrice?" "I saw her." "And?" He was silent for a moment, looking down the long green tunnel of limes. Then he said, "I saw a woman who is afraid, Hastings, but who will not show that she is afraid even to me. I saw a woman who knows, or believes she knows, the identity of her tormentor. And I saw a woman who is resolved to face that tormentor publicly this very night, at the ball, in the presence of all the world. It is not, mon ami, what I should have advised. But Miss Beatrice is not, I think, a woman who takes advice." He rose, brushed a non-existent speck from his sleeve, and offered me his arm with a small, characteristic flourish. "Come. Let us hope that Hercule Poirot can save her in spite of herself." Chapter 4. A fourth letter and a quarrel by the lake luncheon. That day was a movable and informal affair, set out in the long gallery upon a great mahogany sideboard from which the guests helped themselves as they wished. Lady Margaret was constantly summoned away by tradesmen and florists. Felling presided with his usual silent authority. The house seemed full of a quiet but unceasing current of activity, as the great machinery of an English country ball was set in motion. From upstairs came the sound of furniture being moved. From the south lawn, the steady tap-tap of a hammer where the marquee men were finishing the platform for the orchestra. From the kitchens, an occasional crash and the hot smell of pastry. Poirot ate sparingly. A small portion of cold salmon, a slice of veal, a peach, and conversed pleasantly with Mrs. Pelham upon the subject of the late Sir Edward Elgar, of whom she had been, it appeared, a personal acquaintance. I, finding myself for the moment unobserved, attached myself to Daphne, who looked tired and I thought troubled, and who was eating nothing. "Captain Hastings, do come and sit by me. Geoffrey has gone off to look at the river with Iris Lamond, and I am perfectly furious with both of them, and I want a sensible person to talk to. My dear Miss Vyse, I am at your service, though I cannot promise the sensible part." She laughed, but her laugh broke off rather abruptly. "Tell me, do you think a woman ought to marry a man whom she suspects of being capable of falling in love with somebody else, on the very afternoon of the ball at which they are to announce their engagement?" "I think," I said carefully, "that a woman ought to consider very seriously what she has seen and what she has only imagined." "Oh, I have seen it. I am not a fool, Captain Hastings. I am not even particularly inexperienced. They have known each other, you see, since long before he and I were engaged. He swore to me last autumn that all that was over, and now she is here, and they—" She broke off. After a moment she said more steadily, "You will think me ridiculous." "I do not think you ridiculous at all. Aunt Beatrice thinks I am ridiculous. She thinks I should send him away. She told me so this morning in plain terms. She said—" Daphne hesitated. "She said that there are things she knows about Geoffrey which I do not, and that I had better take her word for it that my marriage to him would be a great folly. Of course, that is what Aunt Beatrice always says about everything. But this time she was different. She was almost gentle, Captain Hastings, and Aunt Beatrice is never gentle." "Did she tell you what she knew?" "No, She said she would tell me after the ball, or write it down for me. She said Mr. Hodge, the solicitor, you know, was to come on Saturday morning, and that there were to be changes for the better, Daphne, for all of us who are honest and have been used badly. Those were her words. I said nothing for a moment. From across the gallery, Sir Julian was laughing softly at something Mrs. Pelham had said. The Reverend Crail, his face pink as ever, had a glass of hock in his hand. Poirot, I observed, was watching us with the most innocent of expressions, and I knew at once that he had seen quite as much of Daphne's face as I had, and had drawn his own conclusions. Miss Vyse, I said, would you be willing to repeat what you have just told me in confidence to my friend Monsieur Poirot? She bit her lip. Oh, I do not know. He frightens me a little. He need not frighten you. He is, between ourselves, the kindest of men. Very well. After luncheon, bring him to the rose garden at 3. I shall be there. I did so. At 3 o'clock, in the small circular enclosure of clipped box and old roses about the sundial, Daphne told Poirot what she had told me, and Poirot listened with that peculiar quiet attention which is in truth the great instrument of his power. He asked her perhaps a dozen questions, all of them small, all of them precise. When she had finished, he took her hand for a moment in his small neat one and said, Mademoiselle, you have done very well to tell us this. You will do better still if you say nothing of it to anyone else, not even to your aunt. Continue with the ball. Continue with all the arrangements as if nothing were the matter. Trust your aunt to her own resources for one more evening, and trust myself, Hercule Poirot, to give to you, in due course, the truth that you require. She thanked him and left us, and we walked together by the long border of larkspur and delphinium back towards the south terrace. Poirot, I said, what can Miss Beatrice know about Standish? That, mon ami, is one of the questions that we shall, I think, have shortly an opportunity to answer. But before that, he stopped, and his face had grown grave. There is another matter. While you and I have been speaking with Mademoiselle Daphne in the rose garden, a 4th letter has been delivered to Miss Beatrice, or more precisely a 5th. Felling brought it to my attention not 10 minutes ago. Good Lord, how was it delivered? That is the most curious thing of all, Hastings. It was placed upon a small silver salver upon the hall table, with the rest of this afternoon's post, between the time Miss Bran brought down the morning post, about 11, and the time the second delivery from the village arrived, about 2:30. The hall is in constant view from the foot of the staircase and from the door of the long gallery, yet no one observed the letter being placed. Have you seen it? I have. Felling very wisely brought it directly to me. It is, like the others, typewritten upon ordinary commercial paper, and the envelope is plain. The text is short. It says merely, Speak tonight, and you will not see the morning. B? Signed B? Signed B. Beatrice's own initial. Précisément. Or, if not Beatrice's own initial, then the initial of someone who wishes us to think that Beatrice writes them to herself. A possibility, mon ami, which one cannot wholly exclude. You think she might write them to herself? But why? For attention, for drama, for revenge upon some particular member of this household whom she wishes to expose, or conceivably in some confused fashion which only the medical men could explain. I do not myself believe it, but I am bound to consider it. Miss Beatrice is an actress, Hastings, of the most natural and accomplished kind, and one must always allow for the possibility that the leading actress is also the producer. We walked on in silence for some moments. The sun was slipping westward. The lanterns above us in the lime avenue caught the light. From beyond the home wood came the sound of voices raised, and presently we made out, as we approached the lake, the figures of Geoffrey Standish and Mrs. Lamond standing together upon the little wooden boathouse jetty. They were quarrelling. We could not, of course, hear distinct words at that distance, but the gestures were unmistakable. Mrs. Lamond stood very straight, her arms folded, her dark head a little thrown back. Standish was speaking to her with a short, urgent, jabbing motion of his hand. Once she laughed sharply. Once he seized her wrist, and she pulled it away with a violence that nearly threw her off balance. Then, while we stood half hidden by a clump of rhododendron, Standish swung on his heel and walked off rapidly along the lakeside path. And Mrs. Lamond, after a moment of perfect stillness, took out a cigarette, lit it with a steady hand, and walked off in the opposite direction. Eh bien, Hastings? They were certainly quarrelling. They were certainly quarrelling. Of what, do you suppose? Of his marriage to Daphne, I should imagine. She wishes him to break it off. Possibly. Or he wishes to break it off and she wishes him not to. Or they are quarrelling about money, or about some past affair, or about the conduct of a third person. There are many possibilities. Let us hold them all in our minds and prejudge nothing. We made our way back to the house. In the long gallery, Lady Margaret was speaking with the leader of the orchestra, a small spare man with a violin case under his arm. In the drawing room, Roderick Vyse was alone, drinking a whisky and soda with quick, nervous gulps. He looked up as we passed, and I observed that his eyes were red-rimmed and his hand none too steady. "Mon ami," murmured Poirot, "let us speak briefly with Mr. Roderick. He has, I think, the look of a man who is in need of a confessor." He turned aside into the drawing-room. I followed. "Mr. Vyse, we do not intrude, I hope?" "Eh? Oh, Poirot. No, not at all. Will you join me? It is rather early for whisky, but the day is hot and— You are too kind. A small soda water, perhaps, for myself. Hastings will join you, no doubt. Mr. Vyse, I have a small confession. I am, as you may know, a detective, and I am incapable of being in a room with a person of intelligence without observing him. You have today the air of a man who is in some difficulty. Forgive me if I am too direct." Roderick Vyse looked at him for a moment, and then, to my great astonishment, set down his glass and put both his hands over his face. "Oh God," he said quietly. "Oh God, Mr. Poirot, I am in the most appalling difficulty. The most appalling difficulty in the world." "Tell me," said Poirot very gently. "It will not, perhaps, be so very bad. It will be the end of me. I owe money, you see. I owe a great deal of money. To certain persons in town. They will not wait. I had counted upon a certain expectation being met, and now my Aunt Beatrice has, as you heard last night, decided to alter the will. She has not told me what she means to do, but she will not look at me kindly, Mr. Poirot. Not since some weeks ago. She's been told something. Someone has told her something about me, and I do not know what it is. Mr. Vyse, can you guess what it might be?" He looked up. His eyes were quite wet. "There are several possibilities," he said, with a kind of wretched honesty. "I have not been a good young man, Mr. Poirot. I have some of my debts, debts of which my aunt would entirely disapprove, and I have done one or two other things that perhaps I should not have done. But none of them would justify her cutting me out as she has been hinting. None of them. I have sometimes wondered whether someone is feeding her lies. Whom do you suspect?" He hesitated, then he said, Sir Julian Mortlake. He hates me. He has always hated me. He thinks the place ought to be his. He is the senior male of the Vyse line. There has been a thing about it for years. He has been whispering to Aunt Beatrice. I am sure of it." "Have you any proof?" None at all. It is just that I know him. He is—" Roderick made a vague, despairing gesture. "He is the kind of man who, when he wants a thing, sets about getting it without telling anybody." We left him a few minutes later. Poirot had made him no promises, except that he would, if it were possible, see that justice was done. As we walked up the great staircase to dress for tea, my friend said softly, "3 persons, Hastings, with strong reasons to wish Miss Beatrice to die before Saturday morning. Roderick, who fears disinheritance. Sir Julian, who, if Roderick is right, stands to gain. And, possibly, our friend Mr. Standish, of whom Miss Beatrice claims to know something to his discredit. To these I add a 4th, Mrs. Lamond, whose interest I do not yet understand, and a 5th, Miss Brand, the companion of whom I know almost nothing, and a 6th, Lady Margaret herself, whose calmness is, perhaps, a little too perfect to be wholly innocent. 6 suspects, mon ami, and we have until tonight, until the lanterns are lit, and the orchestra plays, and Miss Beatrice walks out as she has sworn to denounce her tormentor before the assembled company, to discover which of them is our man, or our woman, or our pair." Chapter 5. The Lighting of the Lanterns. I have, at this point in my narrative, the unenviable task of describing the Midsummer Ball at Thornton Park as it appeared in the moment of its first beauty. Before, that is, the dreadful event which transformed it forever in the memories of those who attended. The day faded towards 8 o'clock, in a long slow dimming of gold to rose, of rose to lavender, of lavender to a deep sea green in which the first stars began to appear over the home wood. The orchestra, a small accomplished London ensemble of 16 players, took their places upon the platform at the south end of the lawn. The marquee, white and immense, glowed like a paper lantern from within. And at 8:30 precisely, 2 of the gardeners with long brass tapers began the lighting of the 300 Chinese lanterns that hung in long, swooping lines from the trees and the colonnades. I have said 300. There may have been more. They were of all colours: pale blue, pale red, pale green, pale gold, some round, some pear-shaped, some in the form of dragons. They were strung between the limes of the great avenue. They ran along the parapets of the south terrace. They bobbed gently in the warm breeze above the parterre and the rose garden. As each was lit, a small soft glow appeared in the gathering dusk, and slowly, as the gardeners worked their patient way along the avenues, the entire estate seemed to rise into a kind of magical second life, until at last, from the windows of the house, one looked out upon a garden swimming in coloured light. The first guests began to arrive at 9. They came up the long drive in motor-cars and dog-carts, the men in their tailcoats and white ties, the women in long gowns of every imaginable shade. They were greeted in the marble hall by Lady Margaret, who stood that night in a gown of dark blue and a tiara that had belonged to her husband's mother. By 10:15, perhaps 200 people were upon the lawn. The orchestra was playing a slow waltz. Champagne glasses caught the lantern light. The air was full of laughter and the heavy sweet scent of jasmine. Of the persons of our particular interest, I will note their appearances and their occupations as I observed them through the early part of the evening. Lady Margaret remained for a long time near the door of the marquee, greeting late arrivals. She was, throughout, a model of composure. Sir Julian Mortlake danced with several of the older ladies, then with Mrs. Pelham, and at length stood at the edge of the lawn smoking a small black cigar. Daphne, in white silk with a wreath of ivy in her fair hair, danced with Geoffrey Standish in a manner which to a careless observer seemed entirely happy. Only those who had spoken with her that afternoon would have observed how much of that happiness was acting. Geoffrey Standish, I'm bound to admit, danced very well. Mrs. Lamond did not at first appear. She came down at perhaps 10:30 in dark red, and was at once surrounded by a small court of younger men. The Reverend Crail, in clerical evening dress, sat for a long time with Mrs. Pelham at one of the small lantern-lit tables on the terrace, eating ices. Roderick Vyse drank a great deal of champagne and danced not at all. Of Miss Beatrice Thornton Vyse, on this all-important evening, I must speak with greater particularity. She came down at 10:20, wheeled by Miss Brand. She had refused, I afterwards learned, the chairlift. She had insisted upon being carried down the great staircase by 2 of the footmen, and then placed in her wheeled chair in the marble hall, from which Miss Brand wheeled her out, by the south door onto the terrace. She wore a gown of deep purple silk, more elaborate than the black silk of the night before. She had powdered her thin face, painted her thin lips a careful red, and wore in her white hair a small comb of paste diamonds. She looked, in spite of her wasted hands and her air of pain endured, almost magnificent, a kind of gaunt, painted, defiant queen. Miss Brand wheeled her chair to a particular spot upon the terrace, just at the head of the broad shallow steps that led down to the parterre and a little to the west of the south door. There a small table had been placed, with a single glass of champagne and a single flat silver dish of sweets. Miss Beatrice was placed where she could see the entire dancing floor, and where the entire dancing floor could see her. She sat very upright. She drank from time to time a sip of her champagne. She received, with formal grace, the attentions of those guests who came to greet her. To certain persons, I observed, she nodded, but did not offer her hand. Among those whom she received with marked coldness were Sir Julian Mortlake, Mr. Standish, and, more surprisingly, the Reverend Crail. Among those whom she greeted warmly were Mrs. Pelham, Daphne, and a number of older guests whom I did not know. Roderick she did not greet at all. His approach having been, I noted, halted at a distance of perhaps 10 paces by a single steady look from his aunt. At 11 o'clock, the orchestra paused for a short interval, and supper was served in the marquee. Most of the company drifted thither, leaving the terrace and the parterre in the soft, half-empty stillness, which a great party briefly achieves between its phases. I had carried a plate to one of the small tables on the terrace, and was about to fetch champagne for Mrs. Pelham, when Poirot, who had been moving among the guests all evening, with the air of a perfect old gentleman of leisure, came suddenly to my side. "Hastings, where at this moment is Miss Beatrice?" "Upon the terrace. I saw her not 3 minutes ago." "Show me." I led him out. The terrace was nearly empty. A few couples lingered at the far end. The great purple chair at the head of the steps stood as it had stood, with one difference. Miss Beatrice was in it, upright as before, the silver dish of sweets and the half-empty champagne glass at her elbow. But her head had fallen a little to one side against the cushion, and her painted mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were closed. I went forward, called her name and touched her hand. The hand was cold. "Poirot," I said. He was beside me in an instant. He bent over her, took her wrist, then her throat. After a moment that seemed very long, he straightened. "She is dead, mon ami. She has been dead, I should think, perhaps a quarter of an hour. Good God, a heart attack? She was very ill. It is possible. It is also possible that it is something else. Hastings, find Lady Margaret. Quietly. Tell her and her alone what has occurred. Send for a doctor, and then return to me at once." I went. I shall not record the brief, dreadful conversation I had with Lady Margaret in the supper marquee, drawing her aside while she was speaking to a vicar's wife. I shall not record her silent moment, and her almost immediate perfect command of herself, and her quiet word to Feeling, who at once telephoned for Dr. Beddoes from the village. I returned to the terrace within 10 minutes. By the time I reached it, Poirot had already drawn a screen of potted bay trees about the great chair, and was standing beside Miss Beatrice with his small notebook in his hand. "Hastings, look here." He pointed to the silver dish. There were perhaps a dozen sweets in it, small chocolates, small almond comfits, 2 or 3 crystallized violets. One of the chocolates lay just outside the dish, on the white tablecloth half bitten. Miss Beatrice's lips, I now observed, bore a single faint smudge of chocolate at the corner. You think she was poisoned? I think it is possible. We shall know when Dr. Beddoes has done his work and the analysts theirs. But see, he pointed to the half-eaten chocolate. This one piece, mon ami, has been bitten and discarded. Why? Because it tasted disagreeable. Because the bitterness of, let us say, a strong vegetable alkaloid was disguised by the chocolate, but not perfectly enough. Yet she had already swallowed enough. Strychnine? Possibly. There are signs, the slight rigour about the jaw, the position of the body, which would be consistent with strychnine. But it might be something else. An overdose of her own medicine, perhaps. She was taking a number of drugs for her affliction. We must not be premature. He bent again over the body very gently and lifted, with the tip of one careful finger, the corner of the silk shawl that lay across her knees. "And Hastings," he said quietly, "there is also this." He showed me what lay upon her lap, half hidden by the shawl, a folded paper, and beneath the paper a small flat object of yellow metal which I afterwards discovered to be an ornamental key. "What is the paper?" He unfolded it carefully, holding it by the corner. It was a single sheet, typewritten, of the kind we had now had abundant opportunity to know. It said, "Now you have spoken. B. Chapter 6. Dr. Beddoes and the Silver Dish." Dr. Beddoes arrived from the village within 20 minutes of Felling's telephone call. He was a square-built, sandy-haired man of perhaps 50, with a quiet, capable manner and the unhurried economy of speech which one finds, sometimes, in the better class of country practitioner. He had been Miss Beatrice's physician for 11 years, and was acquainted with the household. Lady Margaret, by this time, had quietly contrived to bring the ball to a controlled conclusion. The orchestra was instructed to play one further set of dances. The supper marquee was kept open. The news of Miss Beatrice's collapse was given out simply as a sudden indisposition, and the guests, whose curiosity was naturally aroused but whose discretion as country neighbours was equally engaged, accepted this account and within an hour had departed in their motor cars and dog carts down the long drive. The lanterns were left burning. The orchestra packed their instruments. By midnight, the house and the gardens were left in their full, strange beauty to ourselves and to the dead. Doctor. Beddoes, in the meantime, had been brought by Poirot to the screen terrace and shown the body. He examined it for some minutes in silence. Then he drew Poirot and Lady Margaret aside into the small room called the morning room, and I, by Poirot's gesture, accompanied them. Sir Julian Mortlake also came, in his capacity as a relative and a barrister. The others were dispersed in their various rooms to await the inquiries that all knew must follow. "Lady Margaret," said Dr. Beddoes, with the gentleness of long professional practice, "I am most deeply sorry. I shall write the certificate in due course. But I must tell you frankly, before I do so, that I cannot at present write a certificate of natural death. There are signs which I do not like." "What signs, doctor?" "The colour of her skin, the position of her hands." "A faint odour upon her breath which I cannot at present identify, but which I do not associate with any of her customary medicines. And, in particular," he paused, "the condition of her pupils, which is not what one would expect either from cardiac failure or from a stroke. I propose to telephone the coroner first thing in the morning. There must, I am afraid, be a post-mortem. Of course. I must also ask before I leave that the silver dish of confectionery which stood at her side and her glass of champagne be preserved untouched, and I should be obliged if Monsieur Poirot, whose presence here I am told is fortunate, would seal them in some safe place until the analyst comes." "That has already been done," said Poirot quietly. "The dish, the glass, and a folded paper which lay upon her lap are in my care. I shall surrender them to the proper authority." "Excellent. Lady Margaret, I shall return at 8 in the morning." When the doctor had gone, Lady Margaret sat down at her own writing table and put her hands flat upon its surface, and for the first time that night I saw her show a tremor of distress. "Margaret," said Sir Julian in his soft, careful voice, "you should go to bed. There is nothing more to be done tonight." "Julian, do not be foolish. I cannot go to bed." "Monsieur Poirot, you will of course remain. I should be very greatly obliged, if you would take charge of the matter until the police arrive, in such a way as preserves what dignity we may. I know that you have no official standing here, but I trust you, Monsieur Poirot, more than I should trust any superintendent from the county. Madame, I am at your disposal. I shall require at first light a private word with each member of the household. Until then, I beg you only to ensure that no person leaves the grounds, and that no person enters Miss Beatrice's rooms, save Miss Brand, who must of course attend to certain immediate things, and who will do so in my presence." "It shall be as you say." Sir Julian had been listening with an expression which I could only describe as carefully neutral. He now said, "Margaret, with your permission, I should like to remain here also, in my professional capacity. The family must at this point be advised. There will be, you understand, considerable matters of inheritance and of legal procedure, particularly in light of what Beatrice said yesterday. You are not, of course, the executor of her will, Julian. No, Mr. Hodge of Hodge and Pemberton is the executor. He was, as you know, expected on Saturday. I shall telephone him at first light." Yes, please do." Sir Julian rose, bowed slightly, and went out. Poirot, who had observed this small exchange with the air of a man storing many small details, drew his chair a little closer to Lady Margaret. "Madame, I must ask you a question, very plainly. Forgive me for the necessity. Who, in this house, knew the precise terms of the will under which Miss Beatrice was at present operating?" She thought for a moment. "Myself, Sir Julian, who drew it 10 years ago, Mr. Hodge, who has been the family solicitor since he succeeded his father, Beatrice's banker, who would have been informed of the principal dispositions, and in general terms, Roderick, who knew that he was the principal beneficiary, Daphne, who knew that there was a substantial provision for her, and 1 or 2 charities which had been informed of their bequests. And the new will, of which she spoke last night. I know nothing of it. Truly, Monsieur Poirot, she had not told me. She had told Sir Julian nothing. She had told, I believe, only Mr. Hodge. He was to come on Saturday with the new draft. It was already prepared, I gathered, in accordance with her instructions of perhaps a fortnight ago. A fortnight ago? So the new will has already been drawn, and is in Mr. Hodge's office, and was to be signed on Saturday. Yes. Madame, that is a fact of the very greatest importance. We shall send to Mr. Hodge tomorrow, and we shall, I think, ask him to bring with him the document. For if Miss Beatrice has died before the signing of the new will, then it is the old will which prevails, is it not? It is? And the principal beneficiary of the old will is Mr. Roderick Vyse. Yes. There was a silence. Lady Margaret very slowly raised her grey eyes to Poirot's. You think, then, she said, in a voice that was barely audible, that someone has murdered Beatrice in order to prevent the signing of that new instrument? Madame, I think nothing yet, but it is a hypothesis we must consider. There are others. Until the post-mortem, until the analysis of the chocolates, and until I have spoken with each of the persons in this house, I shall not commit myself. Now, Madame, you are exhausted. Go to your bed. I shall remain awake until morning. Hastings will, I have no doubt, share my vigil. And tomorrow, as the saying is, we shall be all of us in better case to consider what must be done. She went. The door closed behind her. Poirot sat down at the small Sheraton table at which he had sat, took the folded letter from his pocket, smoothed it carefully under the lamp, and beckoned me to look. Mon ami, the paper, the typewriter. Observe. I bent to look. The paper was a plain commercial bond, of the kind sold in any town stationer's. The type was that of a portable typewriter, with the lowercase e slightly out of true. There was no address, no date, no signature, except the single block letter B. Now, said Poirot, tell me, Hastings, at what time did Miss Beatrice arrive upon the terrace this evening? At about 10:20. And at what time did she die? You estimated, a quarter of an hour before we found her. And we found her at about 11. Précisément. Therefore, mon ami, between 10:30, when she was certainly alive, and approximately 10:45, when she was certainly dead, somebody approached Miss Beatrice with a poisoned chocolate, induced her to eat it, and afterwards placed in her lap a typewritten note, the production of which had to be prepared in advance. Or alternatively, the note was placed in her lap before she ate the chocolate, and the murderer afterwards withdrew unobserved. Or, as a third possibility, the note had been with her all evening, brought down by herself, and the chocolate placed in the dish without her knowing. We do not yet know which of these is true, but we shall, before this case is over, know it precisely. He folded the paper again. The morning-room clock struck 1. Allons, some coffee, I think, and then to work. The grey cells, mon ami, must be at their very best in the next 24 hours. Chapter 7. The Interviews of the Morning. I had, in spite of my intentions, slept for perhaps 3 hours upon the sofa in the morning-room, with a rug over me which I could only suppose Poirot had thrown there in the night. He himself, when I awoke at 6:30, was already shaved, dressed, and engaged upon his second cup of coffee at the small table by the window, where he had set out in their orderly little ranks his notebook, his pencil, and a large sheet of paper upon which I now perceived, drawn in his small precise hand, a plan of the house and gardens. Bonjour, mon ami. You sleep like the soldier you once were. The household stirs. Felling has brought me coffee and intelligence. Doctor. Beddoes will return at 8. The local inspector, a Mr. Crawley of the county constabulary, has been informed and is expected at 9. We have therefore a small interval in which I propose to speak privately with each member of the household. Will you have the goodness to fetch them to me, in such order as I shall now name? Of course. First, Miss Brand. She has, I think, the freshest and the least offended memory. She's not yet quite frightened. Second, Mr. Roderick Vyse, who is, I expect, half drunk and half remorseful, and may be candid for that reason. Third, Mademoiselle Daphne. Fourth, Mr. Standish. Fifth, Mrs. Lamond. Sixth, Sir Julian Mortlake, whom I deliberately leave to last because his guard is higher than that of any other person in this house, and the things that he has heard the others say will assist me, perhaps, in the questioning of him. The Reverend Crail and Mrs. Pelham I shall see briefly afterwards. Their part in this affair is, I think, peripheral. I went and brought to him, in the morning-room, Miss Brand. She came in with her sandy hair newly drawn back, in a plain dress of dark blue, her eyes red-rimmed, but her manner perfectly composed. Poirot rose, set a chair for her, and sat down opposite. Miss Brand, you will forgive me. The questions are necessary. I shall be brief. How long have you been with Miss Beatrice? 6 years and 4 months, Monsieur Poirot. You came to her as a companion, in the strict sense, not as a nurse. I am not a trained nurse. I was at first her secretary. Her affliction increased, and so did my duties. I have, in recent years, performed many of the offices of a nurse, but I have no formal qualification. You are devoted to her, She hesitated, and then she said with what I judged to be absolute honesty, "I have been devoted to her, Monsieur Poirot. She has not, in the past year, been an easy mistress. She's been in great pain, and she has taken it out sometimes on me. But yes, on the whole, yes, I was devoted to her. She had been good to me." "In what way good?" "She has spoken of providing for me in her will. She has paid for my younger sister's education at Cheltenham. She has been, in her manner, extremely generous." "You expected, then, to benefit at her death?" "I expected perhaps a small annuity. She had told me as much. I do not know whether the new will would have changed it." "Did she discuss with you the new will?" "Not in detail. She said only that there would be changes for the better, for those who deserved." I assumed I should not be the worse off. I did not press her. "Now, Miss Brand, the chocolates, the dish on the terrace last night. Whose was it?" "It was Miss Beatrice's own. It is a small silver bonbonniere which she keeps always in her sitting room. It was filled yesterday afternoon by myself from her box of Charbonnel and Walker, which is sent up to her every fortnight from London. I always do it. She has, you understand, a particular sweet tooth, in spite of the doctor's warnings." "You filled the dish yesterday afternoon. At what time?" "A little after 4 o'clock, while she rested." "And from that time until the dish was carried down to the terrace, where was it kept?" "In her sitting room, upon the table by the window." "Was the door of her sitting room locked at any time during that interval?" "No." "It is never locked during the day. Miss Beatrice always insisted that it should not be. So between 4 o'clock and 10 last night, any person in the house could have entered the sitting room and tampered with the dish." She paled. "Yes, I had not thought of it in those terms, but yes, any person could have done so." "At 10 o'clock the dish was taken down." "Yes, by myself. I placed it on the small table on the terrace, beside the champagne glass which Felling had set there. I wheeled Miss Beatrice down at 10:20, as you know." "During the half hour between your placing the dish on the terrace and her arrival, was the dish unattended?" "It was. The terrace was being used by guests, but the small table was, you might say, screened from the main flow of company by the bay trees in their tubs. So a second opportunity?" "Also, yes. Miss Brand, you're an intelligent woman. Whom in this house do you suspect?" She looked at him for a long silent moment. Then she said, "Monsieur Poirot, I do not wish to do harm to anyone, but you have asked me. I think Mr. Roderick is in a desperate state, and I do not think Sir Julian is what he seems, and I am afraid of Mr. Standish, though I cannot tell you why." "Thank you, Miss Brand. One last thing. The letters, the anonymous letters. Did you ever at any time see one of them being placed?" "Never." "Did you ever see in any room of this house a typewriter?" She looked startled. "Why, yes. There is the small Corona portable in the library, which Sir Julian uses when he comes down. There is a larger machine in the estate office, which the bailiff uses, and I believe Mr. Standish has a portable of his own. I've seen it in his room when I went in once with linen." "3 machines? Thank you, Miss Brand. That is, for the moment, all." "Monsieur Poirot," she said, hesitating at the door, "there is one further thing. I had not thought to mention it. Perhaps it is nothing. But yesterday morning, when I went up with Miss Beatrice's tray, the door of her sitting room was open, when I had certainly closed it on going out 20 minutes earlier. Miss Beatrice was in her bedroom. She did not know it had been opened. I closed it again and thought no more of it. But this morning, of course, I think of it." "At what hour was this?" "A little before 10. "Whom at that hour did you see in the corridor?" "Mr. Standish was coming up the stairs. He nodded to me and went to his own room. I saw no one else." "Thank you, Miss Brand." "That is a very valuable observation. Pray say nothing of it to anyone." She went out with the same quiet step. Poirot, when the door had closed, made one quick mark upon his paper and looked up. "Eh bien, Hastings, we have already 2 small facts of importance, 3 typewriters, and Mr. Standish on the upstairs corridor at the very hour at which the dish of chocolate stood unattended in Miss Beatrice's sitting room. We shall, before noon, ascertain which of the typewriters produced our anonymous letters, and we shall, before the day is out, learn rather more about Mr. Standish than he has so far been pleased to tell us. Now, send me, please, Mr. Roderick Vyse." Chapter 8. The Confession of Roderick Vyse. Roderick Vyse, when I went to fetch him, had not been to bed. He was sitting in the smoking room, in the same dinner clothes as the night before, with a half-empty decanter of brandy at his elbow and the pallor of a man who has stopped feeling drink some hours ago. He came with me without protest. He looked, in the cold morning light, very young indeed. "Mr. Vise, sit down. You will, I think, take coffee rather than brandy at this hour." "Whatever you say, Mr. Poirot." "Now, let us be plain. Your aunt is dead. The doctor is not satisfied. There will be a post-mortem. There will be, in due course, a police investigation conducted by professionals less indulgent than myself. You will have to answer their questions as well as mine. I propose to you, therefore, that you be entirely candid with me now, and thereby spare yourself, perhaps, a great deal of unnecessary suffering later. Do we understand each other?" "Yes." He did not raise his eyes. "Good. Last evening, at about 4:30, I had with you a conversation in the drawing-room in which you confessed to me that you owed money, that you stood to be cut out of your aunt's will, and that you suspected Sir Julian Mortlake of poisoning her mind against you. Do you adhere to that statement?" "I do." "How much money do you owe, Mr. Vyse?" He hesitated. "About £4,000. To one creditor, or to several?" "To one principal creditor, a man called Schultz in town. He is not, you understand, an ordinary lender. He is a man whom one does not, on any account, fail to repay. You have given him, perhaps, post-dated cheques or notes of hand. I have given him notes of hand to the value of £3,400, due on the 1st of August. And when those notes fell due, and could not be met, what would have followed? He would have presented certain other documents to certain other persons. He would have ruined me. There are matters at my club, you understand, which would not bear—" "I understand. Now, Mr. Vyse, question. At any time during the past 3 weeks did you write, or cause to be written, an anonymous letter to your aunt?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. Before God, no." "Did you at any time enter your aunt's sitting-room yesterday between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 10 in the evening?" He thought carefully. "I went in once, at perhaps 5:30, to ask her whether she would receive me. Miss Brand told me she would not. I left at once." "You did not approach her dish of sweets?" "I did not." "Mr. Poirot, I swear to you, I did not poison my aunt. I should have 1,000 reasons not to do so. If she had altered the will, I should have been ruined. Therefore I had a strong reason to wish her dead before she altered it. I see that. I'm not stupid. But I did not do it. And do you know who did? I do not. Mr. Vyse, look at me. Did Mr. Standish, in the past month, ask you for money?" His head jerked up. "How? How did you know?" "I did not know, I conjectured." "He asked you for money?" "He did, about 3 weeks ago. He said he was in a bad place. He wanted £700. I told him I was in worse case than he was. He laughed. He said, 'Well, you'll come into yours by Christmas, won't you?' And he went away. I thought it was a strange thing for him to say. Now I wonder. You wonder whether perhaps Mr. Standish had reason to think your inheritance more certain than you did yourself?" "Yes." "As though, in fact, he had been informed by some private channel that the will would not, after all, be altered?" "Yes." Poirot leaned forward. "Mr. Vyse, I shall ask you another question, and I require an exact answer. When, 3 weeks ago, Mr. Standish made his request to you for the loan of £700, where did the conversation occur?" "At his rooms in St. James's. I went up to town to see him about a hunt subscription which we had jointly promised." "And did he, in the course of that conversation, refer to your aunt?" Roderick frowned, trying to recall. "He did, now that I think of it. He asked, in a casual way, how she was. I said she was much as usual, difficult, ill, talking of changing her will, as she had done 100 times before. He laughed and said, 'Old ladies do talk, don't they?' And he poured me another whisky, and we spoke of other things. He did not, at any time, suggest that he might be in a position to assist you with your aunt?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. I had not even told him at that point the full extent of my own difficulties. The talk of altering the will was then mere talk. The first letter to my aunt had not yet been written. None of it had begun." "None of it had begun? Précisément?" "Mr. Vyse, one further matter. You went yesterday morning into the Homewood, by the path at the side of the Temple of Diana. What was the object of your walk?" He coloured. "How do you know that?" "Hastings observed you. Answer me, Mr. Vyse. What was the object?" He hesitated for some seconds, and then he said, with the air of one who finds candour after all the easier course, I went to meet a young woman who lives in the village. Her name need not concern you. I assure you she is in no way involved. I see her perhaps twice a week as my circumstances permit. There is nothing more in it. Did your aunt know? Heaven forbid. Was the young woman perhaps the source of any of those debts which trouble you? No. Upon my word, no. She is a most respectable young person, in employment at the post office, and she will not accept a shilling of money from me. She is, I think, the only honest person in my present life. Thank you. I shall not pursue it further. Mr. Vyse, return to the smoking room, drink coffee, eat something. The inspector will arrive at 9, and you must by then be a man and not a sponge. He rose, and at the door he turned and said, Monsieur Poirot, will you do what you can for me? I shall do, Mr. Vyse, what justice will permit. He went out. Poirot rose and walked twice around the table. His small face was very grave. Hastings, the case begins very slightly to take shape, but it is not yet, you understand, the shape that I had at first expected. You think now that Roderick is innocent? I think Roderick is a foolish, weak young man who has been perhaps used in the affair without his knowledge. I do not think he is the murderer. He has, you see, the wrong kind of guilt. The man who has poisoned his aunt exhibits, when he comes to be questioned, either an exaggerated nervousness or, more often, an exaggerated calm. He does not ordinarily cry into his brandy and ask the detective to help him. The murderer of Miss Beatrice, mon ami, is in his nerves a steadier creature than poor Roderick. You suspect Standish, then? I suspect Mr. Standish of a great many things. Whether one of them is the murderer I'm not yet sure. Send, please, for Mademoiselle Daphne. Chapter 9. Daphne, Geoffrey and Iris. Daphne came in pale in a plain morning dress, her ivy wreath gone and her fair hair drawn into a knot at the nape of her neck. She had, I judged, been crying, but she was also, in her quiet young way, perfectly steady. Monsieur Poirot, you wish to see me? Mademoiselle, please, sit. I shall not detain you long. Yesterday afternoon you told myself and Hastings, that your aunt had said to you that she knew things about Mr. Standish which you did not, and which would, in her view, make your marriage to him a folly. Did she say to you what those things were? No, she said only that she would write them down for me after the ball. Did she give you any indication of their nature? Was it a question of money, of another woman, of his past conduct? Daphne hesitated. She said the words, "It is not a question only of Iris Lamond, you understand. There are matters more grave than that." Those were her words. More grave than an attachment to Mrs. Lamond. Thank you. Mademoiselle, and forgive me for the directness, did you last night, between 10 o'clock and 11, leave the dancing floor at any time? I did. Twice. Once at about 10:15, when I went into the house to fetch a wrap from my room. Once at about 10 minutes to 11, when I went into the house for a moment to powder my nose. On either occasion did you go on to the south terrace? On the first occasion, no. I came out by the small door from the gun room. On the second occasion, I came out by the south door, and I passed within 10 feet of my aunt's chair. She was alive then. I greeted her. She nodded to me. She seemed perfectly well. Was anyone else upon the terrace at that moment? She thought. Yes, Mrs. Lamond was. She was standing at the far end by the cedar, looking out across the lawn. There was no one else that I saw. Mrs. Lamond. Thank you, mademoiselle. One last thing. Were you aware, before last night, that your fiancé had, 3 weeks ago, asked Mr. Roderick Vyse for the loan of £700? She stared at him. I was not aware. He has not mentioned it to me. Monsieur Poirot, I begin to think I have been a great fool. It is, mademoiselle, the universal experience of those who love. Console yourself. Send to me Mr. Standish. Geoffrey Standish came in with his usual air of slight perpetual amusement, but I observed that his fine dark eyes, in spite of the smile, were watchful. He sat without invitation. He took out a cigarette without asking and lit it. Monsieur Poirot, a bad business. A bad business indeed, Mr. Standish. Yesterday afternoon, between 4 o'clock and dinner, you were occupied. How? I came down on the 6:20. I was in town all afternoon. And before town, I have been at my flat in St. James's since Monday. You did not enter Miss Beatrice's sitting room yesterday at any hour of the day? I did not. I had been in this house 4 hours when she died. Quite, Mr. Standish. 3 weeks ago you applied to Mr. Roderick Weiss for the loan of £700. Why?" His smile became, for a fraction of a second, fixed. Then it returned. "I had a passing necessity. I did not, in the event, require the sum. Roderick was not, in any case, in a position to oblige me." "You are not, you would say, in financial difficulty?" "I am not in financial difficulty." "Mr. Standish, were you acquainted with Miss Beatrice prior to the present visit?" "I had met her perhaps 3 or 4 times. The acquaintance was slight." "You have never had any private dealings with her of any kind?" "None whatsoever." "And Mrs. Lamond? Your relations with her are—" "Mrs. Lamond is an old friend of my family. I am engaged to be married to Miss Weiss, Monsieur Poirot, as I am sure you know." "As I am sure I know. Thank you, Mr. Standish. That, for now, is all." He went. Poirot, for the first time that morning, allowed himself a small grim smile. He lies, Hastings, almost in every answer. He lies smoothly and consistently, and with the practised ease of a man who has lied a great deal. We shall, in due course, have him on the difficult ground. Not yet. Now, Mrs. Lamond. Iris Lamond was less polished than Mr. Standish, but in her own way no less guarded. She came in a green silk dressing-gown over her morning dress. She did not sit, but stood at the window smoking. "Mrs. Lamond, last night between 10 o'clock and 11. You were where?" "On the lawn, mostly. I went up once to my room between 10:30 and 11:15 for a handkerchief. I came down by the south stairs and stood for a few moments on the terrace, looking out across the lawn, before going down to the marquee." "Did you, on the terrace, approach Miss Beatrice's chair?" "I did not." "Did you observe anyone approach it?" "I did not. I was not facing in that direction." "Mrs. Lamond, yesterday afternoon by the lake you and Mr. Standish quarrelled." "Of what?" She looked at him with a long, level, impassive look. "That is not, Mr. Poirot, your business." "Madame, Miss Beatrice is dead. Her death is the subject of a police investigation. Anything that has occurred in this house in the last 3 days is, regrettably, my business until I am satisfied otherwise. Of what did you and Mr. Standish quarrel?" She was silent for almost a minute. Then she said with a kind of cold, deliberate distinctness, "We quarrelled because Geoffrey Standish is a scoundrel, Monsieur Poirot, and I told him so. I told him that he had no business marrying Daphne, who is too good for him, that he was using her family to dig himself out of his troubles, and that if he did not break off the engagement of his own accord, I should personally write to Lady Margaret and tell her the whole truth about him." "And what is the whole truth about him, madame?" "That he has been, for the past 2 years, the lover of a married woman in Paris, by whom he has a child, that he is at this moment being blackmailed by her husband, and that he is in debt for very nearly £9,000, of which he has told nobody in this house. I know it because I introduced him to the woman 2 years ago in Cap Ferrat, and I have lived to repent of it. I tell you so now because it can no longer harm anyone but him." She stubbed out her cigarette very slowly, in the saucer of Poirot's coffee cup. "And before you ask, Mr. Poirot, no. I did not poison Beatrice Thornton Weiss. I had no quarrel with her. I had not even a particular feeling for her. I saw her last night at 10:20, when she came onto the terrace, and once at perhaps 10:30, when I made my small bow, and never afterwards. If I had wished her dead, I should have had no occasion. Thank you, madam. You have been more useful than perhaps you know." Chapter 10. Sir Julian, the Reverend, and Mrs. Pelham. Sir Julian Mortlake came in last, as Poirot had ordained. He was perfectly dressed, his pipe in his pocket, his sallow face composed. He sat without invitation, crossed his long legs, and waited. "Sir Julian, thank you for the patience with which you have waited. I shall be brief. You drew, 10 years ago, the existing will of Miss Beatrice Thornton Weiss." "I did. Acting in concert with Mr. Hodge, who is the principal solicitor, I was consulted as a relative in matters touching the family settlements. You knew, accordingly, that under that instrument the principal beneficiary was Mr. Roderick Weiss." "I did." "You knew also of the proposed alteration." "I knew that an alteration was contemplated. I did not know its terms." "You had not seen the new draft?" "I had not." "Had you perhaps surmised its tendency?" He smiled. "Monsieur Poirot, you expect a great deal of an old barrister." "Yes, I had surmised. It seemed to me probable, from certain things which my cousin had said in recent months, that Roderick was to be very substantially reduced. I formed the impression that the principal beneficiary, under the new instrument, would be Mademoiselle Daphne. I cannot give you my authority for that impression beyond a series of small remarks. You would, I think, draw the same inference upon the same evidence. And was there any provision for yourself, Sir Julian, of which you had reason to know? There was, I believed, a small legacy, of perhaps £2,000, the same legacy as in the existing instrument. You were not, then, expecting to benefit by the alteration? I was not. Sir Julian, yesterday afternoon in the Lime Avenue you were observed in conversation with Mademoiselle Daphne. You were heard by the captain here to say to her, "Then I suggest, my dear, that you say nothing whatever to your aunt until after the ball." Of what did you speak? He inclined his head, as if he had expected this question. I had spoken to Daphne about Mr. Standish. She had come to me that morning asking for my advice. She had grown distrustful of him. She was thinking of going at once to her aunt and saying that she would prefer to be released from the engagement. I advised her, on the contrary, to say nothing until after the ball, when the formal announcement was no longer impending and reflection could be calmer. It seemed to me that whatever followed would be the better for not being decided in haste. Did you suspect, in advising her, that Miss Beatrice was likely to be murdered before the morning? His face, for the first time, hardened. Monsieur Poirot, I will not be addressed in that fashion. Forgive me. The question, however, stands. Did you suspect any threat upon the life of your cousin? I knew of the anonymous letters. Margaret had told me yesterday morning. I had not thought them sufficient to indicate murder. Had I done so, I should have telephoned at once for the police. I have instead much to reproach myself with. Where, last night, were you between 10:30 and 11:15? In the marquee, principally. I went out once, at perhaps 20 to 11, to smoke a small cigar upon the south terrace. I did not approach my cousin's chair. I did, in passing, observe her, and observed that she appeared well. I returned at once to the marquee, where Mrs. Pelham, I believe, can confirm my presence. She has done so. You had, then, anticipated my answer. I had verified one part of it, Sir Julian. Thank you. That is all I shall trouble you with for the moment. When he had gone, Poirot remarked, "An honest answer, mon ami. In a man who has measured every word with the precision of a chemist. He is innocent of the murder. I am almost satisfied of it, but I am far from satisfied of all of his motives." We saw briefly after Sir Julian the Reverend Crail and Mrs. Pelham. Of the Reverend Crail's account, the substance was simply that he had spent the evening playing whist in the small drawing-room with Mrs. Pelham, the wife of a neighbouring squire and old Lady Cumber, who was very deaf. He had stirred from his chair only to fetch ices for Mrs. Pelham, and once, at perhaps 20 to 11, to look in at the marquee, where he had observed Sir Julian smoking and Mrs. Lamond dancing with a young man in a red sash. He had not approached the south terrace at any time. He was visibly distressed by the death and could be of no further help. Mrs. Pelham, the stout musical widow, confirmed all that Sir Julian and Mr. Crail had said. She added one curiosity, that during the supper interval, between 11 and 15:15, she had observed Mr. Standish go up the south staircase from the hall, alone, and remain absent for perhaps 8 or 10 minutes before reappearing in the marquee. He had explained on his return that he had gone to fetch a fresh handkerchief. "Mon ami," said Poirot, when Mrs. Pelham had gone, "we have now the broad shape of the evening. Let us reduce it to its skeleton." He took up his pencil, and upon the back of his plan of the house wrote in his small precise hand, 10:20. Miss B, wheeled to terrace by Miss Brand, alive, well, dish full. 10:30. Daphne goes to room for wrap, gunroom door, not terrace. 10:30. Iris Lamond on lawn at far end. 10:35. Standish dancing with Daphne in marquee, per Daphne. 10:40. Sir Julian on south terrace smoking cigar, sees Miss B alive. 10:45. Approximate time of death. 10:50. Daphne re-enters house by south door, passes Miss B's chair, greets her, nods returned. But Miss B should already be dead by this time. 11. Body discovered by Hastings and Poirot. "Hastings," he said, looking up sharply, "you observe the difficulty?" Daphne says she greeted her aunt at 10 to 11, and her aunt nodded. "But you say her aunt was already dead by then?" "Précisément. One of three things must be true. Either Mademoiselle Daphne is mistaken in the time, or her aunt was not yet dead, in which case my estimate of the time of death is in error, or He paused. Mademoiselle Daphne was not, when she crossed the terrace, looking at her aunt at all, but at someone else. Or finally, Mademoiselle Daphne tells us a deliberate untruth. We must, mon ami, return to her with this, but not until I have one further thing in my hand. He rose. Hastings, come with me to the library. We shall, if you please, consult a typewriter. But before we left the morning room, he paused at the window, his small dark eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance. Mon ami, I will say to you a thing. The case which presents itself to my mind now is not the case which I had at first formed. There has been at work in this house more than one will and more than one design. The anonymous letters which began this affair are a thing of one mind. The death of Miss Beatrice last night is, I begin to think, the work of a different mind. They are not the same person. They have used each other, perhaps without knowing it. We are, mon ami, not in the presence of one criminal but of two, and it is the second who has done the murder, while the first, who began the matter in mischief, may now be very frightened indeed. I confess that this observation surprised me considerably, but I had by long experience learned not to press him for elaboration when he was in the very act of constructing his theory. We left the morning room and went to the library. Chapter 11. The Typewriter and the Gardener's Boy. The library at Thornton Park was a long room panelled in oak, with 3 tall windows giving upon the south terrace, the books bound in calf and morocco standing in 2 galleries about the walls. At one of the windows stood a small writing table, and upon it, in a leather case, the Corona portable which had been mentioned by Miss Brand. Poirot drew it out, set it upon the centre table, and inserted a sheet of the household's bond paper. Now, Hastings, the text of last night's note. Now you have spoken. He typed it in his careful 2-fingered fashion and drew out the sheet. Compare. I bent over the original letter which he had laid beside it. The two were unmistakably from different machines. The lowercase e on the original was tilted. On the library Corona it stood square. The A on the original had a pinched bowl. On the Corona it was open. The spacing was different. Not this one, then. Not this one. Now, Hastings, the estate office. The bailiff, I'm told, has gone to market. The office will be empty. We crossed the kitchen wing, and in a small whitewashed room at the back found a heavy old imperial machine of the office sort. Poirot tested it. The E did not match. The A did not match. 2 machines down, Hastings. 1 remaining. Mr. Standish's portable in his bedroom. We must contrive to get to it. He will surely never let us. He will not need to let us. Felling will let us. Lady Margaret has given me the run of the house. We went accordingly up to the east wing where Mr. Standish had been put. Felling, at our request, opened the room with his master keys. The bed was unmade, the window open, a faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air. Upon a writing table, beneath a closed lid, was a small dark green portable typewriter. Poirot opened it, set in a sheet of the same bond, and typed, "Now you have spoken." He drew out the sheet and laid it beside the original. The E was tilted to precisely the same angle. The A had the same pinched bowl. The spacing, as nearly as I could judge, was identical. Eh bien, Hastings, the letter that we found upon Miss Beatrice's lap last night was typed upon this machine. Then Standish wrote them all. It is one possibility. Another is that someone else used his machine in his absence. Another, that someone else has at his disposal a machine of the identical model with the identical defect. We must not, at this point, leap. But yes, it is a probability of high order that the writer of the letters had access to this room, and in all likelihood to no other. He shut the lid carefully, restored the machine to its position, and we left the room. As we descended the great staircase, Felling came up to meet us, with a small folded paper in his hand. "Monsieur Poirot, the under-gardener's boy, William, asks to speak with you. He says it concerns last night." We went to Lady Margaret's morning room, where William, a freckled lad of perhaps 15, was twisting his cap in his hands. "Yes, my boy, what is it?" "If it please you, sir, I were in the parterre last night, with Mr. Pringle lighting the lanterns, until 10 o'clock and after. Then Mr. Pringle let me go and watch the dancing from the cedar at the corner. I was standing there, sir, by the cedar, between 10:30 and 11:15, and I see something, sir, which I think you should know. Speak, my boy." "I see a gentleman, sir, come out of the south door of the house. He went over to the old lady's chair, the one that died, sir, and he stood there a moment." He took something from his pocket and he put it on her little table, and he picked up something off her little table, and he put that in his pocket and he went away. And after a bit, the old lady, she went funny, sir. She slumped a bit, like she was sleeping. My boy, could you see who the gentleman was? Not at first, sir. The lanterns was bright, but his back was to me. But when he came round the side of the parterre going back, I see his face plain enough. It was the dark gentleman with the moustache, sir, the one as came down from London on the train. Mr. Standish, that were his name, sir. They called him Mr. Standish in the kitchen this morning when we was talking of who was who. My boy, at what time exactly? I couldn't say to the minute, sir, but it were after the orchestra had played the third waltz, and before they begun on the polka. That'd be about, 20 to 11, near enough. Did the old lady speak to him? No, sir. She were already sitting still, leaning a bit. He didn't speak to her either, that I see. You said he took something from her table. Could you see what? The boy thought hard. It was small, sir. Smaller than a snuff-box. A bit of paper, maybe, or a folded card. He put it in his inside pocket, and he buttoned his coat. And what he placed upon the table? That I see better, sir, because he had it in his open hand a moment first. It were a bit of folded paper, white, like a letter. He put it down beside her champagne glass. Why did you not come forward at once? The lad coloured. I were afraid, sir, Mr. Pringle, he said, as he'd take a stick to me if I were caught watching the dancing. I were where I shouldn't have been, sir. I waited till morning to think, and then with the old lady dead, I thought I'd best speak to you, sir, as Felling said you was the gentleman to speak to. You have done extremely well, my boy. You have perhaps given me the central thread of the case. You will in due course repeat all of this to the police inspector. Until then, say nothing of it. Nothing at all, you understand, even in the kitchen. Here is half a crown for your trouble. Here is another for your silence. When he had gone, Poirot sat for some moments in silence. Then he rose, and his small face wore an expression I had rarely seen upon it. An expression of cold, quiet anger. Hastings, consider what the boy has told us. The folded paper found in Miss Beatrice's lap, the note signed B, was placed there at 20 minutes to 11 by Mr. Standish. And, what is more interesting, he removed something from the table at the same moment. Something which had been there before he came. A folded paper. A letter, perhaps. You think she had something written upon her. I think Miss Beatrice came down to the terrace last night with a paper of her own. A paper which she meant, when the moment came, to use against her enemy. I think Mr. Standish removed that paper and substituted his own. The typewritten note signed B, which we found upon her, designed in advance and intended to misdirect us. I think, mon ami, that we have been from the first moment in the presence of a substitution of evidence, a substitution of identity, perhaps, a substitution of one crime for another. We are very nearly there, Hastings, but not quite. Inspector Crawley has arrived. Dr. Beddoes is with him in the library. Be so good as to send them to me. Chapter 12. Mr. Hodge, of Hodge, and Pemberton. Inspector Crawley, when I brought him to Poirot, proved to be a heavy, slow-spoken man of perhaps 45, with the steady, patient eye of one who has spent 20 years in country police work and is not, on that account, a person to be despised. He had with him a sergeant and a constable. He listened to Poirot's account of the night and morning with grave attention, took the silver dish, the champagne glass, the typed note, and the bond paper from Mr. Standish's typewriter into his own custody, and observed at the conclusion, "Well, Monsieur Poirot, I can only say that we are obliged to you for your handling of the matter so far. The business is, as you say, an awkward one. I shall not at this stage take Mr. Standish into custody. The boy's evidence will need confirmation, and we have not the analyst's report upon the chocolate. But I shall ask Mr. Standish to remain on the premises, and I shall set my constable at the door. Perhaps, Monsieur Poirot, you would be good enough to assist me in the further questioning that is now to be done." "With pleasure, Inspector." While Crawley and Poirot conferred, the morning had advanced, and at a little before 11, the long-awaited Mr. Hodge of Hodge and Pemberton was at last announced. Lady Margaret had telephoned him at first light. He had taken the next train. He came in, an old, very small, very neat gentleman with a wing collar and a black silk stock, carrying a leather portfolio in one hand and a black hat in the other. He greeted Lady Margaret with a quiet, formal sympathy, was introduced to Inspector Crawley, was introduced to Poirot, and was at once invited to take part in our conference in the library. "Mr. Hodge," said Poirot, I shall not pretend that we do not all know why your presence here is, at this moment, of importance. Miss Beatrice was to have signed today in your office or in this house a new will. Is that so? It is so. The instrument was prepared upon her instructions a fortnight ago, and was, indeed, in the portfolio I now carry. I was to have brought it down with me on Saturday morning. Will you be so good, Mr. Hodge, as to inform us in confidence of the principal dispositions of that new instrument? The old solicitor hesitated only a moment. Lady Margaret, you give your consent. I do, Mr. Hodge. Inspector, this is a privileged matter, but in the present circumstances— Quite, sir. Pray proceed. The new instrument provided as follows. The bulk of Miss Thornton Vyse's estate, approximately I should say, upon a fair estimate, £410,000, was to pass, in equal shares, to Miss Daphne Vyse and to Miss Ellen Brand, the testator's companion. To Mr. Roderick Vyse, £10,000. To Sir Julian Mortlake, £2,000. To Lady Margaret, the contents of the East Wing and certain specific jewels. To various servants, charities and old friends, sums totalling some £20,000. The executor was to be myself. There was a profound silence in the library. Lady Margaret had grown very pale. Daphne, she murmured, and Ellen Brand, in equal shares. In equal shares, Lady Margaret. Miss Thornton Vyse was, I should say, particular upon the point. She wished it expressly to be understood that Miss Brand had given her, during 6 years of constant attendance, a service of devotion such as no money could repay, and that she did not wish Miss Brand's portion to be in any way contingent or grudging. That was her wording. Inspector Crawley, who had been making notes, looked up sharply. Mr. Hodge, did Miss Thornton Vyse inform Miss Brand of the provision? She informed me, Inspector, that she had not done so, and did not propose to do so until after the signature. And Mademoiselle Daphne? Asked Poirot. Was not informed, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Thornton Vyse said, on the occasion of taking my final instructions, no one is to know, Hodge, until I have set my hand to it. It is too dangerous. Too dangerous. Poirot repeated the word slowly. She used precisely that expression. She did. I confess that I thought it, at the time, rather a strong word for an old gentlewoman to use about her own testamentary arrangements. I attributed it to the eccentricity of an invalid. I now wonder whether I should have attended to it more closely. You were not, Mr. Hodge, in a position to know what we now know. No, but she was. She was in a position to know, Monsieur Poirot, and the words she used reflected, I am sure, a real apprehension. Miss Thornton Vyse, for all her brusqueness, was a woman of the most acute judgment. She did not commit melodrama. If she said the matter was dangerous, it was. Mr. Hodge, one further question. Was there, in addition to the new will, any other document which Miss Beatrice had instructed you to prepare? There was. A statement, in her own hand, sealed and to be opened only by her instruction or after her death. She gave it to me sealed 2 weeks ago, and asked me to keep it in my safe. It is here. I have brought it down today. In the present circumstances, I judge it proper to surrender it to the inspector. He drew from his portfolio a square envelope sealed with red wax. Inspector Crawley took it, examined the seal, and broke it carefully. He read the contents in silence. His face grew slightly grim. Then he passed the paper, without comment, to Poirot. Poirot read it. I watched beside him. The small grave face composed itself into the expression of a man who has seen at last the keystone of an arch. He folded the paper, returned it to the inspector, and said, Inspector, the case is, I think, complete. With Lady Margaret's permission, I should like at 3 o'clock this afternoon to assemble in the long gallery every person who is at present a guest in this house, together with Miss Brand and the principal of the servants. There I shall, if you will permit, lay out before the company the truth of what has occurred. I shall require your authority to do so. You shall have it, Monsieur Poirot. I shall be there with my sergeant. Thank you. Lady Margaret, you will instruct Felling. 3 o'clock precisely. I beg every person be punctual. There are, in the events of last night, certain persons who are owed an explanation. And there is one person to whom that explanation will, I am afraid, mean very much more. When Mr. Hodge and the inspector had withdrawn to confer in the morning-room, Lady Margaret remained for a moment alone with Poirot and myself in the library. She was very pale. Monsieur Poirot, you will tell me, before 3 o'clock, who has done this thing? Madame, I beg your forgiveness. I shall not. I shall tell every person at the same moment. It is, in cases of this kind, the only proceeding which is fair to the innocent. Were I to tell you now, you would, in spite of yourself, betray to the others by your face that you knew. The murderer would prepare a defence. The innocent would not have the comfort of seeing every other innocent face cleared at the same instant. Trust me, madam. 2 hours longer. She bowed her head and went out. Poirot, when she'd gone, turned to me. Hastings, there is one matter I must verify. Will you go to the kitchen and ask Felling in confidence the following questions? At what hour, last night, was the silver dish carried up to Miss Beatrice's sitting room after its filling? Whether anyone, to his certain knowledge, entered the sitting room between 4 and 10, and whether, in particular, any tray or refreshment was sent up to any of the guests during that interval? Bring me his answers. I shall walk in the south parterre. Chapter 13. A Walk Before the Reckoning. There remained, between Mr. Hodges' departure and the assembly at 3 o'clock, perhaps 2 hours. I thought Poirot would spend them in the library in concentration. Instead, to my astonishment, he proposed that we walk. It is fine, Hastings. The sun is high. Let us not weary the grey cells in the heat of indoor rooms. Let us take them out, into the limes, and let them work as they prefer to work in motion. We walked, accordingly, by the south parterre and the lime avenue, down to the Temple of Diana and back. The lanterns in the daylight looked strangely subdued and forlorn, paper shells against the green of the trees, their magic gone with the night. Beneath one of them, a small piece of broken glass gleamed. A champagne flute, perhaps, dropped by some careless guest. Poirot, will you tell me, before the assembly, what the case is? I will tell you, mon ami, the substance, but I shall not give you the detail. The detail you must hear with the rest. Listen. There have been, in this house, 2 crimes, conducted by 2 distinct hands which have not, I believe, fully understood one another's motives. The first crime was the writing of the anonymous letters. They were written by Mr. Geoffrey Standish, who had reason to fear that Miss Beatrice would, before her death, communicate to her niece Daphne, his fiancée, certain damaging facts about himself, and would thereby cause her to break off the engagement. Mr. Standish thought, with his portable typewriter, to terrify Miss Beatrice into silence. He chose to sign his letters with the initial B, knowing that Miss Beatrice would assume, as everyone in this household would assume, that the letters came from Mr. Bunbury, a former secretary of the family who had been dismissed in disgrace some years ago and who had threatened reprisals. Mr. Bunbury was the chief suspect in waiting, the figure whose initial would shield the real writer. It was a clever stroke. Bunbury, you have not mentioned him. He has not been mentioned to us, mon ami, because he has not been at Thornton Park. He lives in Brighton. He has not corresponded with Miss Beatrice for some years, but he existed, and his initial would have served. I learned of him by a small inquiry of Felling this morning. And the second crime? The second crime, Hastings, is the murder. It has not been committed by Mr. Standish, though Mr. Standish has, by his actions of last night, rendered the matter most peculiarly confusing, and has placed himself in a position which he will be hard-pressed to explain. The murder of Miss Beatrice has been committed by another person, a person who, observing that Mr. Standish was harassing her with anonymous letters, saw an opportunity, that is, to commit a quite different crime, of a wholly different motive, and to leave the suspicion of it upon the writer of the letters. The 2 crimes are, you understand, 2 separate operations conducted in parallel. Mr. Standish, on his own account, terrorizing his future aunt. The other person, taking advantage of that terror, choosing the night of the ball as the moment to introduce poison into a dish which was already, by the writer's own design, freighted with associations of menace. Then who is the murderer? Mon ami, I am not yet ready to name. You will hear it at 3 o'clock. But ask yourself this. Who, in this house, had the strongest motive that you have heard? Not financial. The financial motive was distributed among several. Not old grievance. The strongest motive, mon ami, is always the motive that is silent, the motive which a person does not suffer himself to confess even to his own conscience, but which lives beneath and works in the dark. Look for the silent motive, Hastings, and consider, in the light of it, who in this house was not what they appeared. We walked on for some moments without speaking. The bees worked in the limes, the wood-pigeons called. "There is one other thing," said Poirot at length. "Mr. Standish's actions last night. He came down from his room at 20 minutes to 11. He approached Miss Beatrice's chair, by then dead, a fact of which he was, I think, unaware in the first moment. He removed from her table a folded paper which had been placed there by Miss Beatrice herself before her death. He substituted his own typed note. He withdrew. Why? Why indeed? Because, mon ami, the paper which Miss Beatrice had placed upon her own table was a paper of which Mr. Standish had reason to be afraid. It was, in fact, a list of the names of those persons in the household whom Miss Beatrice intended publicly to denounce that night. Mr. Standish's name was upon that list. He had been informed of its existence. By whom, you may guess. He took the list. He substituted his prepared note. He thought himself extremely clever. He did not know that, in taking the list, he was concealing for the murderer the very document which would have revealed who the murderer was. For Miss Beatrice's list, mon ami, contained, alongside the names of those she meant to denounce, the names of those she meant to expose as her secret tormentor, those who, in her judgment, had been working against her in her own household for many months. "You have the list now?" He shook his head. "I have it not. Mr. Standish has destroyed it. He confessed as much to Inspector Crawley not an hour ago, when confronted with the gardener boy's account. He burnt it in his bedroom fireplace at 11:30 last night. He did not know what was upon it. He only knew that he wished it gone. He has, by destroying it, made the work of justice harder, but not, I think, impossible. Then how can you name the murderer at 3? Because, Hastings, Miss Beatrice had taken the precaution of leaving, with Mr. Hodge, 2 weeks ago, sealed in his safe, a duplicate of that list, together with a statement of her reasons for compiling it. I have read that statement. I have, accordingly, the names. And I have one further thing. I have observed in this house who, of those named, has done what at the appropriate hours. The two together give me the answer." We had reached the small classical pavilion, and stood for a moment in its cool shadow, looking back up the lime avenue at the long, low house. From this distance the lanterns appeared as small, drooping, pale balloons, harmless and even pretty. It was not easy to remember that one of them last night had shone down upon the moment of a deliberate killing. "Poirot, you said the murderer was not Standish. You said the motive was a silent one. Was it Sir Julian then? He has the cold mind for it." "He has the cold mind for it. But no, he is not the murderer. The motive he had was not silent enough. It was advertised in every crease of his sallow forehead. The murderer kept their motive truly silent. They presented to the world throughout the appearance of contented obscurity, of a useful and not very interesting role, of the kind of person whom one does not, ever, suspect. Then it must be Mrs. Lamond. She had no obvious motive. She had no motive at all, Hastings. None. I am surprised you persist with her. She has acquired no money by Miss Beatrice's death. She stood to lose nothing by Miss Beatrice's continued life. She had not even a sentimental interest in the affair. The only person to whom she has done a service in this matter is Miss Daphne, and the service consisted, you may recall, in attempting to break off a marriage that would have been disastrous. No, Hastings, Mrs. Lamond is innocent of the murder, though guilty, as we are all guilty, of the smaller sins of indiscretion. Then who? He didn't answer me directly. Instead he said, "Hastings, consider Miss Beatrice's life over the past 6 years. Of all the persons in this house, who has been with her the most? Who has prepared her medicine? Who has laid out her clothes? Who has known the contents of her bedroom, the habits of her diet, the chemists at which her prescriptions were filled, the hours at which she took her drops? Miss Brand. Précisément, mon ami, Miss Brand. Who else could have placed the chocolate in the dish without trace, having filled the dish herself? Who else had access to the upstairs corridor at every hour of the day and night, without exciting comment? Who else had reason to fear, very particularly, that the alteration of the will, of which Miss Beatrice had spoken to her in vague terms only, might in fact reduce her, as the existing will would have done, to a mere small annuity, when she'd spent 6 years of her life in service, hoping for a great deal more? I stared at him. But Poirot, the new will was in her favour. She would have been one of the 2 principal beneficiaries with Daphne. Hodge has just told us. She had every reason to wish Miss Beatrice to live until Saturday. She had every reason, Hastings, if she had known, But she did not know. Recall, Mr. Hodge has told us that Miss Beatrice expressly forbade him to inform Miss Brand of the provision. Miss Brand believed, on the contrary, that the alteration of the will was being made to her detriment. She had heard Miss Beatrice speak of changes for those who deserved. She had observed, in the past months, Miss Beatrice's increasing irritation with her, the impatience of pain, the curt words. She had, perhaps, formed the conviction, unfounded but firm, that she was about to be cast off without provision after 6 years, and so, for her own protection, she resolved that the existing will should not be altered. The existing will was the one which gave her, in addition to her annuity, certain small bequests of jewellery. The new one might give her nothing at all. She acted, mon ami, upon a misapprehension. It is one of the cruel ironies of the case that the woman she murdered had, in fact, intended to make her rich for life. My God! Yes, there is, as I said, no shortage of pity to be felt in this matter, but she has done what she has done, and it cannot now be unmade. And Standish's letters merely gave her the cover she required. Précisément. She read one of them, when Miss Beatrice incautiously left it upon her dressing table. She perceived at once that someone in the household, she did not know who, was pressing Miss Beatrice towards an early death. She conceived the idea of accommodating that someone. She knew that on the night of the ball, with 200 guests in the gardens and the dish of chocolates exposed, the act could be committed in such a way as to suggest the writer of the letters had completed his work. She used a small dose of an alkaloid to which she had access through her invalid mistress's own medicine cupboard. She placed the chocolate herself when she filled the dish at 4 o'clock. The rest, mon ami, was patience. Come, mon ami, it is 2 o'clock. Let us return. Chapter 14. The Assembly in the Long Gallery. At 3 o'clock precisely, the Long Gallery at Thornton Park was, by Lady Margaret's instruction, prepared for the meeting that was now to occur. Felling had set the chairs in a wide arc facing the great fireplace. A small table, at which Inspector Crawley and his sergeant sat, had been placed to one side, and at the centre, with his back to the empty hearth, stood Hercule Poirot, his small neat hands folded before him, his head inclined slightly forward in that habitual attitude of polite attention, which I had so often, in the course of our adventures, watched precede the most devastating of his disclosures. The persons present were as follows: Lady Margaret in a chair to the right of the hearth, very pale but composed, Sir Julian Mortlake beside her, his long sallow face inscrutable, Roderick Vyse in the same suit he had worn through the night, his eyes fixed upon the carpet, Daphne in a dress of dove grey, her hands folded tight in her lap. Mr. Geoffrey Standish, with 2 of the inspector's men standing at a small distance behind his chair, whose presence was not directly explained but was sufficiently evident. Mrs. Lamond, smoking, with her usual air of cool detachment. Mrs. Pelham, the Reverend Crail, and Mr. Hodge of Hodge and Pemberton, occupying the further chairs in the ark, and, in the chair at the extreme left, sitting very straight in her plain dark dress with her hands quietly folded, Miss Ellen Brand. I sat a little behind Poirot, with my notebook upon my knee. "Ladies and gentlemen," began Poirot, "I shall not waste your time with preliminaries. You're gathered here because last night in this house, Mademoiselle Beatrice Thornton Vyse was murdered, poisoned, by means of a chocolate placed in her own silver bonbonnière. The poison was an alkaloid. The chocolate was bitten and immediately discarded. The dose, however, was sufficient. Miss Beatrice was dead within minutes. Inspector Crawley has the toxicological confirmation upon his desk. We may take the medical fact as established. I propose now to set before you, in such order as will best illuminate the matter, the events which led to this murder, and the persons who have, in different ways and in different degrees of guilt, taken part in it. There were, in this affair, 2 distinct lines of conduct which have, at 1 or 2 points, become entangled, and in the entanglement have produced the crime that is now before us. The first line of conduct was the writing of the anonymous letters which troubled Miss Beatrice during the past fortnight. The second line of conduct was the murder itself. They were the work of 2 different persons. They had 2 different motives. They have, until this morning, been most thoroughly confused with one another. I shall endeavour to separate them. The writer of the letters was Mr. Geoffrey Standish. Mr. Standish, at this, made a small movement of protest, but the constable's hand upon his shoulder kept him in his seat. Mr. Standish, continued Poirot, was acquainted with the fact that Miss Beatrice had, by some means, learned of his liaison in Paris with a married woman, of his blackmailing by her husband, and of his very considerable debts. He knew that Miss Beatrice intended, before the ball or shortly after it, to communicate these things to Mademoiselle Daphne, his fiancée. Such a communication would have ended his engagement, and with it his hopes of solving his financial difficulties through marriage to the heiress of a great estate. He took therefore the step of writing to Miss Beatrice anonymous threats, designed to frighten her into silence. He typed them upon his portable corona which he keeps in his bedroom. The type, when compared this morning, is identical to that of the letters in our possession. He signed the letters with the initial B, in the calculated hope that they would be attributed to Mr. Bunbury, a former secretary of this household, whose name is on record as a malcontent. His scheme was foolish. It was also cruel. It had the effect, however, not of intimidating Miss Beatrice, but of provoking her into the very public defiance which we observed at dinner upon Tuesday. He was thus driven, by the failure of his terrorism, to a more direct measure. Last night, on the south terrace at 11:20, having observed Miss Beatrice's chair from the marquee and judged her absent or asleep, Mr. Standish approached the small table beside her, removed from it a folded paper which he believed to contain damaging matter relating to himself, and substituted for it a fifth typewritten note, prepared earlier. He withdrew, returned to his room, burned the paper he had taken, without, it appears, reading it, and rejoined the company. He was observed in this act by William, the under-gardener's boy, who watched the scene from beneath a cedar at the corner of the parterre. Mr. Standish has this morning, in the presence of the inspector, admitted to the substance of these acts. He is not the murderer of Miss Beatrice. He is, however, guilty of grave offences, of writing letters intended to put a person in fear, of removing and destroying evidence in a case of unlawful death, and of attempting, by the substitution of his note, to mislead the investigation. Inspector Crawley will, in due course, address the law to him. A short silence followed. Mr. Standish had, by the end of this speech, turned a curious yellow colour, and had ceased to look at any face in the room. That, then, is the first line of conduct. I turn now to the second. On the evening of last night, between 4 o'clock and 10, the silver dish of chocolates from which Miss Beatrice was, when on the terrace, accustomed to take her sweets, stood unattended in her sitting-room. Into one of those chocolates, a person who had access to that room, and to a quantity of strychnine, procurable from Miss Beatrice's own medicine cupboard, in which it was kept as a stimulant for the heart, introduced a fatal dose. The chocolate so prepared was distinguishable by a small mark at its base, which the murderer had made with a fingernail. The murderer, having access to Miss Beatrice's chair and table at any moment of the evening, was able to ensure that the marked chocolate was within Miss Beatrice's reach, and to make certain that no other person ate it. At a moment when Miss Beatrice was alone upon the terrace, at perhaps 10:15, while the orchestra was playing the first of its waltzes, the chocolate was eaten. The bitterness of the alkaloid caused Miss Beatrice immediately to discard the unfinished portion, but the dose she had swallowed was sufficient. Within 10 or 15 minutes she was dead. The murderer had foreseen all of this. The murderer had also foreseen Mr. Standish's letters, and had chosen this particular night so that the act might be attributed to the writer of those letters. There remains then only the question, who is the murderer? I shall ask Mr. Hodge, the family solicitor, to read aloud, with Lady Margaret's permission, the principal terms of the new will of Miss Beatrice Thornton Vyse, and the statement which she deposited with him a fortnight ago. Mr. Hodge rose, opened his portfolio, and read. He read, first, the financial provisions of the new will, with the great bequests to Daphne and to Miss Brand in equal shares. There was a movement of astonishment in the gallery. Daphne pressed both hands to her mouth. Miss Brand did not move at all, but her face, which had been pale, became now a clear, almost translucent white. He read, second, the sealed statement. It was brief. Miss Beatrice, in her own hand, set out that she had during the past several months come to believe that she was the object of a deliberate and patient enmity within her own household, that she did not yet know the identity of the enemy, that she had drawn up for the security of her affairs after death a list of the persons of whom she most strongly suspected, and that she desired to make publicly known, before her death or after it, that her trust and her gratitude were placed not in those whom the household had assumed to be her favourites, but in two persons only, Mademoiselle Daphne Vyse her niece, and Miss Ellen Brand, her companion. Mr. Hodge sat down. Poirot turned very gently towards Miss Brand. "Mademoiselle Brand, you did not know, did you, of the provision in the will?" She did not answer. "Mademoiselle, 6 years of devotion, a new will of which you knew nothing, the fear that you would be discarded in an instrument that was, in fact, written entirely in your favour, a misapprehension, mademoiselle, which has cost 2 lives, your mistress's, and now, I am afraid, your own. Will you tell us, mademoiselle, when you placed the strychnine in the chocolate?" She raised her head. She looked for a long moment at Poirot. Then she said, in a voice that was perfectly clear and not quite steady, "At 20 minutes past 4, while she rested, I had her keys. I took the strychnine drops from the cabinet. I put 1 drop into a chocolate. I placed it on the side of the dish nearest her right hand. I knew she always took those first." She stopped. Her fingers in her lap opened and opened again. "She had been very cruel to me," she said quietly, "in the last 2 months. She had said more than once that I should not perhaps find it possible to remain, that perhaps she had made too much of me, and that I should learn to expect less. I thought she meant to dismiss me with nothing. I thought, after 6 years, I thought I should be put out into the world without any provision. I knew her drops. I knew her chocolates. I knew the night of the ball would offer the moment. I took it." She looked down at her hands. "I did not know about the new will. Monsieur Poirot, I swear to you, if I had known—" "Yes, mademoiselle, I know that you did not know." Inspector Crawley rose. The interview, in its formal sense, was over. The rest belongs to the records of the law. Chapter 15. The Threads That Remained. The arrest of Miss Ellen Brand was effected with a quietness that surprised me at the time, although on later reflection I came to think it was the only conduct possible in such circumstances. Inspector Crawley placed her formally under caution. She made no further admissions in the gallery. The constable went up with her to her room while she packed a small case, and at 4:30 she was driven away in a private car to the county police station, where she would be charged with the murder of Beatrice Thornton Vyse, and remanded in custody to await the assizes. She wept, I was told, only once, and that quietly, when she was passing through the south door of Thornton Park for the last time. Mr. Geoffrey Standish was not, in the event, taken into immediate custody. The inspector, having taken from him a long-signed statement, and surrendered him into the more particular care of his solicitor, who was telephoned for and arrived from London in the course of the evening, satisfied himself that there was no danger of flight. Mr. Standish would, in due course, face charges of demanding money with menaces, of attempting to pervert the course of justice, and of certain matters relating to his Parisian affair which were, I gathered, of some seriousness. He would not, I should imagine, find his accommodation in His Majesty's pleasure of a kind to which he was accustomed. Daphne, when at length the gallery had emptied, came to Poirot in the small drawing-room. She had been crying, but she came in without affectation, and she put out both her hands. "Monsieur Poirot, I do not know how to speak. I have learned in 2 days that the man I was to marry is a scoundrel, that the woman who lived with us, whom I trusted utterly, is a murderess, that my aunt, whom I thought disliked me, has left me a fortune, and that—" she paused, "and that it is possible to be in a single moment both a great deal richer than one ever expected and a great deal poorer in spirit. Mademoiselle, you have learned much. You are young. You will learn also in time the more difficult lesson, which is to live with what you have learned. Do not, mademoiselle, despise yourself for having loved Mr. Standish. He has the kind of charm which is most useful when it is most hollow. Many older and harder women have been deceived by it. You are not yet of an age at which it would have been reasonable for you to see through him. And Miss Brand, she was so quiet, Monsieur Poirot, so gentle. She brushed my aunt's hair every night. She read to her when the pain was bad. Could she truly, mademoiselle, there is in every human heart, even the gentlest, a place that may be touched by fear of poverty and by jealousy of those who seem to receive without deserving. Miss Brand had, for 6 years, watched persons whom she felt had given less than herself receive, or expect to receive, greater rewards. She had, in addition, lived in close attendance upon a woman whose pain made her sometimes cruel. To one who has not stood in such a position, the temptation is invisible. To one who has, it is perhaps not so very strange. I do not seek to excuse her. I seek only to remind you, mademoiselle, that the murderer is rarely a monster. The monster would be easy to detect. It is the ordinary person, the trusted person, the patient and self-effacing person who, when the silent motive at last takes hold, is most dangerous of all. That is why we must always, mademoiselle, watch a little, even those whom we believe we know." She kissed his hand and went out. I do not believe she ever, in later life, became quite the carefree girl I had first met upon the terrace, but she became, I am told, an excellent landowner, and a notably kind one to her tenants, and at length she married a quiet country doctor who, by all accounts, deserved her. Sir Julian Mortlake came in briefly, said the few formal words appropriate, and left for London by the evening train. He had behaved throughout with a coolness which gave nothing away. If he was disappointed in his expectation of £2,000, which under the existing will would not in the event be paid him, since the alteration had not been signed and the original proportions remained, he did not show it. He had, I suppose, the consolation of having borne himself with dignity in a difficult business, and that to a man of his stamp was not a small thing. Roderick Vyse, whose £10,000 legacy under the new will would now not occur, but who, under the old will, was to have inherited the bulk of the estate, which he now did to an extent that astonished him, came to Poirot with an air of half-embarrassed gratitude. He was, in spite of his vices, not a wholly bad young man, and the events had, I believed, sobered him to a degree which the future would justify or not, depending upon his strength. Poirot spoke to him, in private, for perhaps a quarter of an hour, of which I never learned the substance, except that Roderick at the end of it shook the small Belgian's hand with a kind of solemnity, and went out with what, in his face, appeared to be a measure of resolution. Mrs. Lamond left without ceremony. She came past us in the hall in her travelling clothes, with her cigarette in her holder, and her dark eyes a little tired. "Goodbye, Mr. Poirot. Goodbye, Captain Hastings. I shall not see you again, I hope. Nothing personal, you understand, but I dislike places where I have been mistaken." She held out her hand, took ours each in turn, and said, "I was wrong about Beatrice. She was a better woman than I credited her with being. I shall not soon forget it. The Reverend Crail and Mrs. Pelham, the two innocent and entirely peripheral members of the company, stayed an extra night, mostly out of consideration for Lady Margaret, whose distress was visible in spite of her composure. They left on the following morning with appropriate assurances of prayers and condolences. Lady Margaret remained. So did we. That evening, after dinner, a small subdued dinner of 3, in the small drawing-room rather than the great panelled hall, she sat with us before the fire. The lanterns in the garden had been taken down, the marquee was dismantled, the gardeners moved about the parterre with rakes and barrows, restoring it to ordinary use. The house was, very gradually, settling itself again into the rhythm of its days. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I owe you a great deal. Madame, you owe me nothing that the matter did not require. You have given my niece her freedom. You have prevented a catastrophe of a different kind, by which Mr. Standish, undetected, would have continued to ruin her. You have set Roderick upon what I believe is a better road, though I dare not be certain. You have given my poor Beatrice, in the only way that is now possible, the dignity of a clear account of her death, and you have done it all in 24 hours, with a quietness that has spared us the worst of the public spectacle. Madame, the public spectacle, when the case comes to court, will not be entirely avoided. No, but the worst of it will by then be old news, and we shall have braced ourselves. You have given us, Monsieur Poirot, the breathing space in which to do so." He inclined his head. "Madam, I have one curiosity which perhaps you will satisfy. When you wrote to me a fortnight ago, what was it precisely that drove you to do so? You did not, then, know of the murder that was to occur. Was it the letters alone?" She was silent for some moments. It was not only the letters, it was a feeling that had come over me, gradually during the spring, that there was a wrongness in the house. I could not have told you why. I had begun to find Beatrice frightened, when she had never been frightened in her life. I had begun to find Miss Brand. She paused and looked into the fire, unusually quiet, and one afternoon in May I came in upon them in the small sitting-room. Beatrice was speaking to her. Miss Brand was looking down at her hands, and the light in Miss Brand's face when she raised her eyes for an instant to mine was so completely unlike anything I had ever seen there, that I went out without speaking and walked in the rose garden for an hour. I did not then suspect anything of the sort that has happened, but I had a feeling, and when the letters were spoken of, I thought to myself, the little Belgian, he looks at faces. He saw the Duchess at Pembroke. He will see whatever is in this one. I was not, Monsieur Poirot, mistaken. Madame, you were not mistaken. You were also extremely wise. Was I? I have wondered in these last 2 days whether I should not have spoken to Beatrice that day in May, whether if I had done so none of this would have come to pass. Poirot looked at her gravely. Madame, I cannot tell you. The grey cells are not so omniscient as to answer questions of that sort. I can tell you only that there are times when the kindest course of action leads to disaster, and times when an apparent neglect leads, by paths we cannot foresee, to safety. We do what seems right at the moment with such light as we have. We do not always do well. We sometimes do better than we think. Sleep tonight, madame, with what comfort that may give you. She nodded, and after a few moments rose and went, with a very gentle smile to each of us, to her room. When she'd gone, Poirot sat for some time looking into the fire. Mon ami, he said at length, shall we, on the day after tomorrow, return to London? Whenever you like, Poirot. Tomorrow we shall walk. The country is beautiful. I am, between ourselves, a little tired. I thought I had not, in 15 years of acquaintance, ever heard him admit it quite so directly. I said nothing in reply, but I poured for us each a small glass of brandy, and we sat without further words, while outside the long English summer twilight settled at last upon the gardens of Thornton Park. Chapter 16. The Quiet Drive Home. We did in fact walk the next day. Poirot and I walked in the morning by the long yew walk and down to the lake, and in the afternoon in the kitchen garden, where the apricots upon the south wall were beginning to colour. We spoke of small things. We did not, by silent agreement, speak of the case at all. On the second day after the assembly in the gallery, the hired Daimler came again to the steps of Thornton Park, and Felling, still stately, still impassive, but with what I thought was a softness about the eyes which had not been there at our arrival, saw to our luggage. Lady Margaret came out herself to bid us good-bye. Daphne, in a black dress, kissed Poirot upon both cheeks in the French manner and shook my hand. Roderick was already gone up to London upon errands of business which were, I gathered, of a more responsible kind than those he had hitherto pursued. Good-bye, Monsieur Poirot. Good-bye, Captain Hastings. You will not, I hope, refuse to come again in better times. Madame, with the greatest pleasure. The car drew away. The long brick face of the house, the warm Tudor brick that had so charmed me on our arrival, slipped behind us, the cedars, the gates, and at length the road through the woods, with its pale gravel and its bordering hedges of dog-rose. The morning was as fine as the morning of our coming. Hastings, said Poirot, after we had been a quarter of an hour upon the road, there is something which still troubles you. Speak, mon ami. We have a long drive to Hatfield. I was thinking of Miss Brand. She will hang, Poirot. She will hang. 6 years, and then she goes wrong, in a single misapprehension, and a woman dies, and her own life is forfeit. There is something terrible in it. There is something terrible in it. You do not, however, suggest that she should not be punished? No, I would not say that. Only, it is hard. It is hard, mon ami. It is very hard. The law is, in such cases, severe. It is not, however, unreasonable. A woman's life is taken. A life must answer. Even if Miss Brand had been told the truth about the will, even if she had known herself to be a great heiress, she would perhaps have been satisfied, and Miss Beatrice would have lived. We cannot, however, make our justice depend upon what people would have done if the world had been kinder than it was. We must judge them upon what they did, in the world that was given them. Miss Brand chose the worst path, mon ami. She had others. She might have given notice. She might have asked her mistress directly. She might even, in extremity, have stolen what she thought was owed her and run away. She chose, instead, to murder. The fact that her motive was poverty rather than greed does not, in the eyes of the law, diminish the act, and in the eyes of justice, mon ami, I cannot myself think that it should. You are severe today, Poirot. I am not severe, mon ami. I am merely clear. I have a great pity for Miss Brand. I have also a great pity for Miss Beatrice, who in her last weeks lived in a fear she did not deserve, and who died at the hand of a woman she had honoured with her trust. The two pities, you see, do not cancel each other out. They are simply two separate truths which we who watch must hold together. We were silent for a time. The road wound on. Through the hedges the haymakers were at work in a long pale field. Somewhere, very faintly, a thresher was running. "Poirot, may I ask you one more thing? When you spoke of the silent motive, when we walked together in the parterre that morning, you were already certain it was Miss Brand." I was almost certain. 2 things had brought me to her. The first was the matter of Miss Beatrice's fork. Do you remember? At the dinner upon Tuesday night. She dropped a fork. It was an untidy thing in a tidy woman, and it occurred at the very instant after she had finished a small private remark to me. I observed at that moment that her right hand was trembling. She was an old, sick woman, you may say, and tremor is natural to such. But the tremor I saw was not the steady tremor of disease. It was a sudden, controlled tremor. It was, in fact, the tremor of fear. And the moment of fear had come not at the entry of any particular guest, not at the mention of any particular matter, but at the moment when, behind her, Miss Brand had bent, as Miss Brand had every reason to bend, in her professional capacity, to whisper something into her ear. I noted it. I did not then understand it. I understood it only afterwards, when I asked myself whom she most feared. Not the one whom she had publicly named. She was not afraid of Roderick or Sir Julian, or even Mr. Standish, of whose existence she was contemptuous. She was afraid, mon ami, of the person closest to her, because she had begun in some part of her mind to suspect what was to come. And the second thing? The second thing was the fact that the chocolates had been placed upon the dish at 4 o'clock by Miss Brand herself, and were left in an unlocked room until 10. Anyone might have entered the room, certainly. But only Miss Brand had a free reason to be there at any hour of any day. Anyone else would have had to invent a pretext, and would have run a risk of being noticed. Miss Brand, on the contrary, was constantly in and out. The opportunity was by far most strongly hers. The opportunity is not, by itself, evidence. But combined with motive, and the motive, mon ami, became plain as soon as I learned from Mr. Hodge that the new will was a secret, and that Miss Brand believed something quite different from the truth. It was decisive. The remaining thing I needed was to make sure no other person had had a like opportunity, and to verify that Miss Brand had, in her duties, access to her mistress's medicine cabinet. Both points were established this morning before the assembly. Then I was certain. It is a remarkable case, Poirot. It is in its way a sad case, mon ami. It has not, perhaps, the brilliance of some that we have known. There is no glittering villain, no impossible mechanism. There is only an ordinary unhappy person who, having allowed her resentment to rule her, did a terrible thing under a misapprehension. Such cases, mon ami, are perhaps the truest of all that I have known. The grand criminal is a creature of the imagination of novelists. The real criminals are most of them like Miss Brand, small, unremarkable, taken finally beyond themselves by the silent erosion of grievance. It is the part of the detective, mon ami, to remember, as he does his work, that he is not chasing a monster, but a person not entirely unlike himself. He was silent for a long time. The car climbed a small rise. Through a gap in the hedges we caught a last glimpse very far behind us of the long roofs of Thornton Park, with the homewood beyond them. Then we descended into the trees again, and the house was lost. Eh bien, Hastings, to the dining car when we reach Hatfield and an early luncheon. I have after all an appetite. He smiled, the small dry smile that I had come to think of after so many years as the closest he allowed himself to a sentimental gesture. And as the country flowed past the windows of the Daimler, in the warm bright noon of an English July we rode on in companionable silence towards London, leaving the lanterns of Thornton Park, their season concluded, in their long summer afternoon behind us. The end.